The Grateful Doe case begins with two faded concert tickets in a young man's pocket, and tonight we sit beside the file as if it has been waiting under a small lamp for years. There is no hurry here, only paper, memory, and the slow breath of an old mystery. You can imagine the evidence envelope first, thin and softened at the corners, with a faint dry scent of paper that has lived too long in a drawer. Inside it, the tickets are small, ordinary things, the kind you might forget in a pocket after a long weekend of music. But in the Grateful Doe case, those scraps became a quiet thread. They gave investigators a place to begin, even when the young man himself had no name. The date was the 26th of June, 1995. The road was Interstate 95, near Emporia, Virginia, where the summer air could feel heavy over the pavement. A Volkswagen van had been traveling south. Its driver was named Michael Hager, and in the passenger seat was a young man nobody could identify. You turn that first page slowly, and the case begins not with certainty, but with absence. No wallet, no clear records, no easy way home. The file tells you what was found with him: a tie-dyed shirt, long reddish-brown hair, a small number of personal things. And those two ticket stubs from Grateful Dead shows at RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C., from the 24th and 25th of June, you can almost feel the paper between your fingers, a little bent, a little worn, as if it had traveled through heat, music, dust, and sleep before ending up sealed away. At first, those tickets gave him his name, though not his real one. People began calling him Grateful Doe. It was a gentle shorthand, not enough, but better than silence. We sit with that name carefully tonight because it held a place for him until the right person could finally say who he was. In a case like this, the smallest object can become strangely tender. A ticket stub is not a formal document. It doesn't carry a birth date or a next of kin. It doesn't tell you where someone slept as a child or whose kitchen light they knew by heart. But it says he had been somewhere. It says he had passed through a gate, stood among thousands of other people, and heard music rising into a warm June night. You can picture the detectives in 1995 working with what they had. They had fingerprints, they had dental information, they had a reconstruction, they had clothing and personal effects. They had the ordinary procedures of identification, each one patient and incomplete. The office would have smelled faintly of toner, coffee, and warmed plastic from old equipment. A phone might ring in the next room, and someone would pause with a pencil still in hand. The strange part was not that there was evidence. The strange part was that the evidence felt so human, and still it did not immediately lead home. The Grateful Dead tickets suggested community. They suggested a crowd of people who might remember a face, a ride, a conversation near a van. And yet crowds are soft things. They scatter by morning. They remember fragments, not full names. So the file waited. Years passed, and Grateful Doe became one of those cases people carried gently in the back of their minds. You might imagine a folder moving from one shelf to another, the label fading a little under fluorescent light. The ticket stubs stayed in the record, the clothing stayed in descriptions, the sketches and reconstructions moved through bulletins and databases, searching for someone who would feel recognition settle quietly in the chest. By the time the internet grew into a place where strangers could gather around old mysteries, the case found a different kind of room. Not an interview room, not a records office, a digital room lit by screens at kitchen tables, dorm desks, and late-night corners where people searched because something about Grateful Doe had stayed with them. You sit there too, in this part of the file, with the low hum of a computer and the blue-white glow of a page loading slowly. The weird evidence had not changed. The tickets were still a shirt. The road was still the same road in Virginia, but the world around, the evidence had changed. Now, someone could post a reconstruction, a description, a remembered detail, and people who had never met could compare notes across states and years. The file had grown quieter in the official sense, but louder in the human sense. More hands were turning the pages. One of the unusual things about Grateful Doe is how much the public helped keep him present. People were not only asking, who was this young man? They were asking who had known him before the file did. They looked at the concert dates. They thought about travelers and ride shares, about young people moving between shows with backpacks, cigarettes, borrowed seats, and half finished stories. You can hear that kind of memory softly, like a cassette playing in another room. There was patience in that work. Not the polished patience of a television detective, but the real patience of people returning to the same detail again. The RFK Stadium tickets, the timing, the route south, the young man's face as it had been reconstructed, the long hair, the clothing. Each detail was handled and rehandled, as if warmth might bring out a hidden imprint. Then, years later, something shifted in the file, not with a shout, but with the quiet sound of one name moving closer. A man named Jason Callahan had disappeared from his family's life in the 1990s. He was from South Carolina, and to the people who loved him, he had not simply become a case. He had been a son, a brother, a person with habits and moods, and a life that had once been ordinary enough to feel permanent. You pause with that for a moment, because every unidentified person has another file somewhere, even if it was never written down. A family memory, a missing seat at a table, a question asked year after year. The connection came through images and attention. A man looking into Grateful Doe believed the unidentified young man might be Jason. The comparison moved through online communities, and eventually it reached Jason's mother. That is one of the softest and heaviest turns in the case. A mother looking at a reconstruction. A mother seeing something familiar in a face made by strangers. You can imagine the quiet of that room, the stillness around the screen, the air suddenly feeling smaller. Identification still required science. Feeling was not enough, and the file knew that. DNA testing would have to do what memory could only begin. So the case returned to method. Swabs, records, comparison. The sterile smell of a lab. The careful labeling of samples. The small plastic snap of a tube being closed. After 20 years, the old mystery was still being handled one step at a time. In late 2015, Grateful Doe was identified as Jason Callahan. The name settled over the old file like a blanket placed gently on a sleeping person. It did not erase the years. It did not answer every question about his final days, but it gave back the central thing. It let the unknown young man become himself again. And when you look back at the evidence, those 2 concert tickets seem different. They were never magical. They didn't solve the case alone. But they kept the story pointed toward a real life, toward music, travel, youth, and a community that eventually helped carry his image forward. The weird evidence mattered because it was specific. It gave people something to hold. That is often how patient detective work feels. Not grand, not quick, just a series of small objects kept long enough for the world to catch up to them. A paper ticket, a photograph, a reconstruction, a remembered name, a mother's attention, a DNA result arriving after years of silence. You turn each one gently, because none of them belongs only to the file. The road near Emporia is still a road. Cars still pass under broad summer light, and most travelers never know that a long mystery once rested there. But we know, tonight, because we're sitting with it. We know that evidence can wait. We know that names can return. And we know that sometimes the most ordinary things in a pocket can keep speaking softly until someone finally hears them. And once you hear them, the old objects in the Grateful Duo file begin to feel less like curiosities and more like small lanterns, each one casting just enough light to reach the next. You don't need them to explain everything at once. You only need them to remain where they are, labeled, preserved, and ready for the day when someone knows how to read them differently. That is the quiet discipline of a cold case, and it asks you to trust the slow work. You return to the tickets first, because they're the evidence that gave Jason Callahan his borrowed name before his true one came back. In the file, they sit like proof of movement. Washington, D.C., late June 1995. A weekend of music at RFK Stadium, with crowds moving through heat, denim, cotton, grass, exhaust, and the sweet dusty smell of summer pavement. You can almost hear the low murmur before a show begins, that ocean sound made by thousands of people waiting together. The tickets matter. because they place him in a world with other people around him. They suggest he had been part of a crowd, maybe standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers who felt like friends for one evening. If you were sitting with the case in an archive room, you might rest your finger near the ticket date without touching the paper. The ink would be faded enough to make you lean closer. The old cardboard stock would carry a stiffness that modern paper rarely has. The strange tenderness of it is that concert tickets are meant to be temporary. They're handled at a gate, tucked away, forgotten, washed in pockets, or pinned to a bedroom wall later. They're not meant to become evidence. Yet here they were, kept because they outlasted the moment they were made for. In the Grateful Duo case, two small pieces of admission paper became a kind of map. You can imagine an investigator in 1995 noticing them with practical care. The tickets did not say Jason Callahan. They did not carry a phone number. They did not tell anyone whether the young man had friends at the show, or whether he had traveled with the driver, or whether he had simply accepted a ride from someone he met along the way. But they pointed north. They pointed to a date. They pointed to a gathering where someone surely might have remembered him. So the file widened. It had to include the culture around the shows, the movement of young fans along highways, and the loose networks of people offering rides. You sit with that part gently, because it's not a detective's world exactly. It's a traveler's world. It's parking lots and handwritten signs, backpacks against warm concrete, water bottles passed from hand to hand, and the soft slap of sandals on pavement. Names could be exchanged and forgotten by dawn. The people around those shows often moved with a kind of temporary trust. Someone might know a first name, a nickname, a hometown, or a favorite song, while never learning the full legal identity that would matter later. The investigators had to think inside that looseness. You can feel how difficult that would be, trying to match official procedure to a community built partly on movement. A paper report wants straight lines, but life often leaves circles. The tickets also gave the public something concrete to repeat. When people spoke of Grateful Doe, they could describe him as the unidentified young man found after a crash in Virginia with Grateful Dead ticket stubs from RFK Stadium. That phrase carried better than a case number. It had place, time, and texture. It made him easier to remember, not as a statistic, but as someone who had stood in a crowd only days before his name disappeared from official view. You turn the page again, and the paper sound is soft in the room. The next object waiting in the file is clothing, ordinary and intimate in a different way. The tie-dyed shirt became part of how people pictured Grateful Doe, because clothing can speak in a language that records rarely capture. It can tell you what someone chose that morning, or what they had worn many times before. It holds shape, color, wear, and sometimes the faint memory of smoke, rain, detergent, or sun. You can picture the fabric folded under evidence room light. Clothing in cold cases often has a double life. To investigators, it is description and documentation. To families, it can be recognition. A shirt may be the thing someone remembers from a drawer, a photograph, or a season of life when a person wore the same few clothes over and over. You sit with that possibility quietly. The shirt in the Grateful Duo file did not speak a name, but it kept a sense of the young man's world close to him. There is a softness to cotton after long use. There is a thinning at seams and a looseness at the collar. If the colors were bright once, time can turn them mild, especially after heat, travel, and evidence storage. You can imagine an investigator lifting it carefully, not dramatically, just professionally, noting size, color, pattern, condition. Somewhere nearby, a fluorescent light might hum above metal shelves, and the air might feel a little cool from a window unit. These details matter because an unidentified person must be described with care, but never reduced to description alone. Height, weight, hair, clothing, and dental notes are necessary. They are also incomplete. You feel that as you read. A person is more than identifiers, and yet identifiers are how the search begins. The file is doing the best it can with the language it has. For years, people who studied Grateful Doe online returned to those visible clues. The shirt, the hair, the age range, the tickets, the road. They compared them to missing persons, to family stories, to memory. Sometimes they were wrong, and wrongness is part of patient investigation. You close one possibility, and the file becomes a little more exact. You learn where the answer is not, and that too has value. The internet made this process both larger and stranger. A person at a desk could read a description from Virginia and compare it to a missing person from another state. Someone else could look at an old photograph, then tilt their head, trying to decide whether the jawline, hair, and age were close enough to mention. You can hear the soft clicking of keys at night, the low fan of an old laptop, the cup of tea cooling beside the keyboard. The risk, always, was carelessness. Cold case communities can move too quickly if they forget that real families are attached to every comparison, but the best of them moved slowly, respectfully, and with the humility that uncertainty requires. In the Grateful Doe case, that patience mattered. People kept the evidence visible without turning it into spectacle. They asked the same questions, but many asked them gently. You can feel why the case stayed with people. Jason Callahan was not yet known by name, but his evidence suggested youth, movement, music, and a life interrupted before anyone could make the official connection. There was no elaborate puzzle to solve. There was a person to return. That is a different kind of mystery, and it calls for a different kind of attention. From the clothing, the file leads you toward images, and images carry their own quiet weight. The early reconstructions of Grateful Doe tried to make an unknown face recognizable. That task is delicate. A forensic artist works with structure, measurements, photographs, and whatever information can be gathered, but the finished image must still meet the world as a possibility rather than a certainty. You can imagine the artist's table, pencils laid out, eraser dust near the edge of the paper, the faint smell of graphite and paper fibers. A face emerges slowly. For a listener half asleep, this part of the case may feel almost like watching someone draw by lamplight. First the outline, then the hair, then the set of the eyes, then small changes, each one meant to bring the image closer to a person nobody in the room has met. You sit beside that effort, and you understand its gentleness. The artist is trying to make recognition possible, but reconstructions can be difficult things. They are helpful, and they can also mislead if someone expects them to be exact. A family member might miss the resemblance because one feature feels wrong. A stranger might see resemblance where there is only coincidence. The face is a bridge, not the destination. We keep that in mind as we move through the Grateful Doe file. The images were shared through databases and later through online communities. Over time, they became part of the case's public identity, almost as familiar as the ticket stubs. People copied them, reposted them, discussed them, and sometimes sat with them longer than they expected. You might imagine someone scrolling late at night, then stopping because the young man's face felt unfinished in a way that asked for care. That kind of attention is not the same as knowing. It is more like keeping a porch light on. People could not name him yet, but they could refuse to let him vanish into a drawer. You see this often in long unidentified person cases. Someone outside law enforcement becomes a steady caretaker of memory. They update pages, they answer questions, they correct dates, they remind others that the person was real. For Grateful Doe, the community attention became part of the evidence's life. The tickets were not simply locked away. The description did not simply remain in one agency's files. The case traveled through forums, databases, images, and personal pages until more people had a chance to notice. You can feel the difference between a file waiting alone and a file being carried carefully by many hands. The room changes when the case enters the digital age. The archive smell fades, and you get warm electronics, dust in computer vents, and the faint tap of fingers on plastic keys. Yet the mood remains the same. Someone is still sitting late, reviewing old information. Someone is still comparing one detail with another. Someone is still hoping that the right name will appear without being forced. The strange evidence then was not only physical, it was also social. It was the way a nickname, a pair of tickets, and a reconstruction made a case memorable enough for strangers to keep returning. In patient detective work, memory itself can become a tool. Not official evidence, perhaps, but the condition that allows evidence to be seen again. You move from the images to the databases, and the file becomes quieter again. more technical and orderly. A database is not romantic at first glance. It is fields and entries, dates and categories, measurements and contact information. But when you sit with it long enough, you begin to sense its human purpose. Each entry is someone being held in place so that a comparison can happen later. The screen may be plain, the work is not. Somewhere inside those structured lines, a person is waiting to be matched with their own name. In the Grateful Doe case, databases helped carry information across time. Details that might once have remained local could be seen by people far away. Missing persons and unidentified persons could be compared with more reach than detectives in 1995 would have had on an ordinary afternoon. You can imagine the old case being translated into newer forms, each field asking for precision. Date found, location, estimated age, clothing, personal effects. That translation matters. A poorly entered detail can hide a case. A careful one can bring it forward. If the location is too vague, someone may never connect it to a known route. If the clothing is described too generally, it may not catch memory. If the personal items are omitted, the most human clues disappear. You feel, as you read, how much patient work depends on the quiet accuracy of clerks, detectives, volunteers, and analysts. There is humility in database work. No one hears applause for entering a dental chart correctly. No one makes a dramatic speech over a corrected spelling. Yet those small acts can matter years later. You can almost hear the soft office sounds around them. The printer feeding paper, a chair rolling back, a stapler closing with a muffled click. The case advances by inches. For unidentified persons, time can complicate everything. Families move, records change, agencies update systems, memories grow softer at the edges. A missing person may be reported in one place, while an unidentified person is found in another, and the two records may never meet unless someone notices a shared line between them. You sit with that difficulty, and the slowness becomes easier to understand. Jason Callahan's name was not restored because one single clue shouted. It happened because evidence stayed available, because people kept looking, and because modern comparison methods eventually caught up with the old file. That combination is common in cold case work. Preservation, attention, and timing. The three have to meet. The Grateful Doe case shows how an old mystery can depend on new rooms of attention. A ticket from 1995 could be discussed on a 21st century message board. A reconstruction could be shared by people who had never been near Emporia. A family member could receive a link or image that would not have traveled so easily in the first years after the crash. The file did not change, but its reach did. You can picture the evidence box on a shelf while all this happens elsewhere. It doesn't know it has become part of late-night searches. It doesn't know strangers are comparing photographs. It doesn't know that a mother may one day look at a reconstruction and feel something old and painful move toward recognition. The box only waits. That is what evidence does when it has been kept well. And waiting, in this case, was not empty. It helped that Grateful Doe had become memorable to people outside the official investigation. The nickname itself carried the strange power of tenderness. It was not his name, and no one should forget that, but it was a way to speak of him before Jason Callahan could be restored to the page. You notice how names work in cold cases. They hold space. They give the mind a handle. They allow people to return without saying case number after case number. Still, a nickname can never be the end. The purpose is always to give it back. You can feel that inside the file, as every description points towards the hope of identification. The clothing, the tickets, the reconstruction, the fingerprints, the DNA possibilities, all of them were forms of asking the same quiet question. Who are you? Who is looking for you? Where does this file need to go? That question traveled for 20 years. Not every day in the same way. Not always with the same attention. Some years may have been nearly still. That is how cold cases often move. A lead comes in, gets checked, and fades. A bulletin is issued, then filed. A database is updated, a detective retires. Another person inherits the box. The work continues, but not always visibly. You can imagine the folder's physical life across those years. edges softened, copies added, notes clipped and unclipped. Maybe a photograph placed in a sleeve, then removed for review. Maybe a form printed from a newer system and tucked beside older paperwork. The paper would feel different across decades, some pages slicker, some yellowing, some sharp from a recent printer. Time has textures. There is also the quiet weight of not knowing. For investigators, an unidentified person is unfinished work. For families, a missing loved one is unfinished life. The two unfinished things may exist in separate places for years, close in truth but far in paperwork. That is one of the hardest parts to sit with. You know now that Grateful Doe was Jason Callahan, but the people then did not know. They had to live inside the gap. A gap can become part of family life. A question at holidays, a hope when the phone rings, a habit of scanning faces in crowds. You handle that thought carefully because it belongs to real people. The case file can tell you dates, but it cannot fully tell you what years of uncertainty feel like in a kitchen at night, when the house is quiet and memory refuses to settle. The weird evidence mattered because it kept Jason from becoming only an absence. The ticket said he had been somewhere specific. The shirt and appearance said he had a style, a presence, a way of moving through the world. The online community said people were still willing to look. The DNA said, at last, that certainty could be reached. Each piece did a different kind of work. You turn another page, and now the file asks you to think about the driver, Michael Hager, because his name is part of the same road and the same day. Michael Hager was identified, which made the unidentified passenger's silence even more noticeable. Two people were in the vehicle, but only one had a name in the immediate record. That contrast shaped the mystery. Investigators could learn something about the van, the route, and perhaps the context, but the young passenger remained beyond the reach of the ordinary paperwork that names usually provide. You can feel how uneven a file can become. One side filled, one side blank. The van itself becomes part of the atmosphere of the case. A Volkswagen van carries certain associations, especially in connection with Grateful Dead shows and road travel. You don't need to overstate it. You can picture the shape, the windows, the worn interior, the smell of vinyl warmed by sun, fabric seats carrying dust and sweat from miles of highway. It was a vehicle made ordinary by use, and then made significant by circumstance. For investigators, the vehicle would have been practical evidence, registration, ownership, contents, travel direction, any clue about where the passenger had been picked up or where he might have been going. The road south through Virginia could lead toward the Carolinas, toward beaches, homes, work, friends, or simply the next place. You sit with the map softly, tracing the line with your eyes. Highways hold so many stories without keeping any of them neatly. Interstate 95 is not a quiet country lane. It is a corridor. Trucks, families, students, workers, tourists, and travelers pass along it day and night. In summer, the asphalt seems to hold heat even after the sun lowers. Rest stops smell of coffee, fuel, cut grass, and warm concrete. A young man could move through that world quickly, leaving very little behind that official systems would notice. This is why the tickets carried so much force. They linked the passenger to the show weekend and made the broader travel pattern feel understandable. Without them, he might have been only an unknown passenger in a vehicle. With them, people could imagine a route from RFK Stadium into Virginia and beyond. The evidence did not solve the case immediately, but it gave the story a shape. You can imagine detectives asking the basic questions. Who attended those shows? Who traveled south afterward? Did anyone remember a young man with reddish-brown hair? Did anyone know someone missing from the scene? Did anyone hear of a person who took a ride and did not return? These questions are simple in wording and difficult in practice. A crowd is not a witness who can be called all at once. The Grateful Dead community, like many traveling music communities, had its own loose ways of knowing. Nicknames, first names, hometowns, faces, and stories could circulate without addresses or formal records. Someone might remember sharing food, but not a surname. Someone might remember a shirt, but not a destination. Someone might have thought about the young man years later, not knowing he had become Grateful Doe. You sit with that uncertainty without pushing it into drama. It is simply how human life works at the edges of documentation. Many moments are real but unrecorded. Many meetings matter but leave no official trace. A person can be known warmly for an hour by someone who cannot later identify them to police. Cold case work must often search through that soft, imperfect memory. The file also asks you to consider age. Jason was young, and youth can make a person harder to trace when they're traveling independently. Young adults may move between households, jobs, friends, and plans. They may be expected to call, but not immediately. They may be missed deeply, while still being difficult to place in a system designed for fixed addresses and formal reports. You feel the fragility of that. If you were reviewing the case in the early years, you might have spread several papers across a desk, a description from Virginia, a missing person entry from another state, if one was available and visible, a reconstruction, notes about the concert tickets, maybe a map, maybe a list of possible agencies to contact. The desk would smell faintly of paper dust and coffee, and your hand might pause over the same dates again and again. But the match did not come then. The file continued on. As years passed, the image of Grateful Doe began to belong to a kind of public archive of unanswered names. People who followed Doe cases saw him again and again. He became one of the young, unidentified men whose clues felt unusually personal. The tickets made people lean in. The age made people feel protective. The connection to music made the case easier to imagine and therefore harder to forget. There is a responsibility in imagination. We use it tonight only to understand the investigative path, never to decorate what we don't know. You can imagine evidence rooms and roadmaps because those help you feel the patience of the work. But we leave space around Jason's private life. We don't fill in every blank. Some blanks belong to him, and some belong to his family. That restraint is part of the quiet study. In cold cases, not every unknown is an invitation to guess. Some unknowns are simply places where the file has to remain open, even after identification. The Grateful Doe case was solved in the central sense, because Jason Callahan was named. But the evidence still invites careful thought about how long it took, why it took that long, and what made the answer possible. You turn back toward the online search, because that is where the old evidence found new hands. The people who gathered around Grateful Doe online were doing a form of patient sorting. They looked through missing persons listings, old posts, family notices, and photographs. They shared similarities and corrected each other. They compared time frames. The work was quiet enough to happen in spare minutes, but meaningful enough to last years. You can hear the small domestic sounds around it, a refrigerator humming, a chair creaking, rain touching a window. One person's attention can become a hinge in a cold case, not because they are heroic in a theatrical way, but because they stay with a detail long enough to notice where it might fit. In Jason's case, the possible connection between Grateful Doe and the Callahan family did not arrive from nowhere. It came through people willing to keep looking at faces, dates, and circumstances with care. That is one of the lessons inside this file. Weird evidence may attract attention, but attention must mature into disciplined comparison. The ticket stubs made the case memorable. The online posts kept it visible. The eventual identification required that someone move from curiosity into proper reporting, and that investigators follow with verification. You can feel the chain of custody widening into a chain of care. A photograph can be a powerful thing when placed beside a reconstruction. It can also be uncertain. You may see resemblance in hair, in the line of the face, in expression, though expression is often the least reliable of all. The living face moves, the reconstructed face tries to suggest. Between them is a quiet space where hope can enter too quickly. So the responsible thing is to let science finish the sentence. DNA did that. It gave the case what visual resemblance and circumstantial evidence could not provide alone. You can imagine the lab as a room of clean surfaces and controlled light, not cold exactly, but precise. Gloves, labels, machines working with small samples. A kind of patience different from the archive, but patience all the same. The evidence had waited long enough to meet the method that could answer it. When DNA confirmed Jason Callahan's identity, the old nickname could finally step back. Grateful Doe had served its purpose. Jason's real name returned to the center. You sit with that transition carefully because it is both beautiful and sorrowful. A family received an answer they had needed for many years. A public mystery became a private grief again, with a name restored and a long uncertainty changed into knowledge. Yet even in that moment, the tickets remained important. They became part of the story of how he was remembered by strangers before he was identified by science. Their oddness helped the case travel. Their specificity made people repeat the details. Their connection to a beloved music community drew in those who understood that world. The evidence was weird only because ordinary objects had been asked to do extraordinary work. You might think, as you review the file, about all the other ordinary objects in evidence rooms. A key without a tag, a receipt with fading ink, a necklace, a book, a bus transfer, a matchbook from a place that has since closed. Each object may seem too small to matter until someone asks the right question at the right time. The Grateful Doe case teaches you to treat such objects with respect. The sensory world of old evidence is slow and plain. Paper yellows, ink thins, plastic bags cloud a little, labels curl at the corners, metal cabinets hold a chill even in warm months. You can almost feel the drawer sliding open with a dull scrape. Inside, the past doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet, stored, and waiting for someone patient enough to look again. In that kind of room, a ticket stub is not a souvenir anymore. It is a witness to presence. It says, this person was admitted here on this date among this crowd. It cannot say whether he smiled, whether he was tired, whether he was thinking of home, or whether he intended to call someone soon. But it can say he was there. Sometimes, in a cold case, there is deep mercy in simply knowing where someone was. You move slowly through that idea because it applies to more than one file. Families often live for years with no fixed final point in the story. A confirmed location, even a painful one, can change the shape of waiting. It gives the mind a place to rest, though rest may come with sorrow. In Jason Callahan's case, the identification gave his family the answer that the old evidence had been protecting. Now the file asks you to think about preservation, because none of this could have happened if the early work had been careless. The ticket stubs had to be documented. The physical description had to be recorded. The remains had to be handled in a way that allowed later testing. Records had to survive office moves, system changes, retirements, and the ordinary churn of time. You can feel how unglamorous that is. It is cabinets, labels, signatures, forms, boxes, and policies. It is the slow architecture that lets a later answer stand. Cold casework often depends on people who may never know the final result of their diligence. A person in 1995 might have sealed an envelope correctly and moved on to the next task. They might not have imagined that 20 years later, strangers online and scientists in a lab would still depend on that careful handling. You sit with that anonymous care because it belongs in the story. The file is a long conversation between decades. The first investigators speak through notes and preserved evidence. Later, volunteers speak through posts and comparisons. Family members speak through memory and DNA. Scientists speak through testing. The answer comes when all those voices can be heard in the same room, even if they were never there at the same time. You can imagine laying those voices out like papers on a desk. Here is the road. Here is the van. Here are the tickets. Here is the reconstruction. Here is the online thread. Here is the family name. Here is the laboratory confirmation. None of these alone tells the whole story, but together they return the name Jason Callahan to the place where Grateful Doe once stood. That is why this case feels gentle, even as it remains sad. It is a story of restoration, not restoration of everything because no identification can give back the years that were lost, but restoration of name, family connection, and truth. The file becomes less blank. The unknown becomes known. The evidence, after years of quiet waiting, has done its work. Still, you don't close the folder too quickly. Sleepy investigation is slower than that. You let each object sit in the lamplight a little longer. The ticket stubs, the shirt, the photographs, the database entries, the DNA report. You let them remain ordinary, because their ordinariness is the point. A life is often found again through things that were never meant to carry so much. The concert tickets especially invite a kind of soft reverence. They came from a weekend of noise, music, crowds, and movement, but in the case file, they became silent. The contrast is almost tender. A thing made for entry became a thing made for return. It opened a gate once, then opened another kind of gate years later into recognition. You may imagine a young person keeping ticket stubs after a show, not for evidence, but for memory. Maybe they would be pressed into a book, tucked in a box, taped to a wall. These particular stubs took a different path. They traveled in a pocket into an official record. They became the detail by which strangers remembered an unidentified young man and refused to let the case fade. There is no need to make that bigger than it is. Its smallness is enough. Cold casework is often smallness repeated faithfully. A phone call returned, a record requested, a photograph scanned, a DNA sample compared, a family contacted carefully. Each act might seem modest, but together they can cross 20 years. As you sit with the Grateful Duo case, you may notice how often the answer depended on connection. The concert connected Jason to a place, the nickname connected the case to public memory, the internet connected strangers to the file, DNA connected the unidentified young man to his family. Connection is the quiet word under the whole story, written lightly between the lines. The old investigative tools were not wrong. They were simply limited by the time they belonged to. Fingerprints could help if there was a matching record. Dental information could help if someone knew where to compare it. A reconstruction could help if the right person saw it. But each tool needed its counterpart. Evidence is often a question waiting for the right listener. In 1995, the right listener may not have been reachable. In 2015, reach had changed. Images traveled farther. Online communities gathered around Doe cases. DNA testing had become more accessible in the investigative process. Families could be found through different paths. The case did not solve itself. The conditions for solving it slowly improved. You can feel the patience of that improvement. It wasn't one invention arriving like thunder, it was a gradual thickening of possibility. More databases, better sharing, more public awareness, more careful volunteers, more tools for comparison. A cold case is often solved not because one person suddenly becomes brilliant, but because many small systems become just strong enough to meet the evidence. The file also reminds you that naming someone is not the same as explaining every movement. You may still wonder about Jason's exact route, his conversations, his thoughts, and the small choices that led him into that van. But you hold those questions lightly. The central answer matters most. He was no longer only Grateful Doe. He was Jason Callahan, and that fact returned him to history in the proper way. For sleep, we can let the lesser questions remain soft around the edges. They do not need to be forced. You can picture them like papers not yet sorted, resting beside the main file. Some may never be answered, some may belong only to memory, and memory may have faded by the time the name returned. Patient investigation accepts that not every door opens. What opened here was enough to change everything. The family side of the case is the part you approach with the most care. Public mystery can sometimes make a person feel shared by everyone, but identification returns the person to those who loved him first. Jason's mother, and others who knew him, had lived with absence before the wider world learned the name. When the answer came, it belonged to them in a way it could never belong to the public. You can imagine the feeling of seeing a reconstructed image and sensing familiarity before certainty. The room might have been quiet. Maybe there was the low buzz of a screen, the faint smell of coffee, the ordinary comfort of furniture that had been in place for years. Then the image appears, and the past shifts. Not fully, not scientifically yet, but enough that the heart recognizes a question it has carried. That moment is not evidence by itself, but it is humanly important. It started a path toward confirmation. It shows why reconstructions and shared images can matter, even when they are imperfect. They can bring the right person close enough to ask the next question. They can turn a distant, unidentified case into something a family needs to examine. Then the formal process begins. Contact, comparison, Samples. Waiting again. Waiting is everywhere in this story. Waiting for records, waiting for calls, waiting for test results, waiting for systems to speak to one another. You can feel how strange it must be to wait after so many years of already waiting. To know an answer may be near but still must be handled correctly. The lab result, when it came, did not erase the waiting. It gave it a name. Jason Callahan. Those words changed the file. They changed the public pages. They changed the way people spoke of the case. You might imagine someone updating a database entry, replacing unknown male with identified, or adding the name where the nickname had once stood alone. The keyboard sounds would be small, but the meaning would not. There is a softness in administrative closure when it is done with respect. A record corrected, a family notified, a public page updated. These acts may look plain, yet they carry years inside them. You can imagine the cursor blinking beside Jason's name. A blink, a pause, and then the record becomes more truthful than it was before. For those who had followed Grateful Doe, the identification brought a complicated quiet. Relief, sadness, gratitude, and humility can all sit together. People were glad he had his name back. They were sorry for the years. They understood that the mystery they had studied was someone else's grief. The best communities know how to lower their voices at that moment. We lower ours too, and we keep going through the evidence with that same respect. The phrase weird evidence can sound playful in another setting, but here it means something more delicate. It means evidence that did not look official, yet mattered deeply. Tickets are not birth certificates. A shirt is not a driver's license. A nickname is not an identification. A forum post is not a lab report, but each one held the door open until the final confirmation arrived. You can think of the case as a series of thresholds. The tickets let investigators and the public cross from unknown traveler to possible concert goer. The reconstruction let viewers cross from description to face. The internet let the case cross from local file to shared memory. DNA let the family and investigators cross from possibility to certainty. Each threshold was quiet, and each one mattered. The road itself is another threshold. Interstate 95 carries people between regions, between homes, between versions of themselves. In the summer, you might see heat shimmer ahead of you, and the car interior might smell of fabric, sunscreen, fast food wrappers, and warm plastic. The radio might fade between stations. A traveler might doze against the window, half aware of mile markers passing. That ordinary movement is part of the case's atmosphere. Because Jason was found far from the place where his family could immediately claim him, the highway became a kind of distance made visible. It separated knowledge from need. Investigators in Virginia had an unknown young man. A family in South Carolina had unanswered questions. The connection between those truths existed, but it had to be discovered across geography, time, and record systems. You can feel how easy it is for a person to become misplaced in official terms. Not forgotten by loved ones, but misplaced by the systems meant to connect information. One county holds one part, another state holds another. A family holds memory. A database waits for a match. Until the right comparison happens, everyone is standing near the answer without being able to touch it. That is why patient detective work is often less about brilliance than persistence. Someone has to keep the details alive long enough for comparison. Someone has to resist the quiet discouragement of years. Someone has to enter the record again and again, even when nothing new appears. You turn the pages and feel that discipline in the margins. The Grateful Doe case also belongs to a larger history of unidentified people being named through renewed attention. Across the country, old files have been reopened with newer tools. DNA has answered questions that fingerprints and dental charts could not. Online communities have helped bring visibility to cases that once sat almost entirely within local agencies. Each case is different, but the pattern feels familiar. The past waits, and then the present learns how to listen. Still, we stay with Jason's file because this story has its own particular quiet. The music tickets, the van, the Virginia highway, the public name that came before the true name, the mother's recognition, the DNA confirmation. These are not interchangeable details. They belong to one person, one family, and one long return from uncertainty. You can imagine closing your hand gently over the edge of the desk, grounding yourself in the present as you read. The lamp is warm, the room is still. Outside, maybe there is rain, or maybe only the low hush of late traffic. The case does not rush you. It has already waited for years. It allows you to sit with each fact until the fact feels human. The young man, once called Grateful Doe, was not solved by spectacle. He was identified by the steady meeting of memory, evidence, and science. That distinction matters. It keeps the story from becoming a puzzle for its own sake. The purpose was never to win. The purpose was to restore, to take an unknown file and return it to a human name. When you think about the investigators, you can picture ordinary patience more than dramatic pursuit. Someone reviewed reports, someone checked possible matches, someone answered calls, someone preserved evidence, someone made sure the case could still be worked when new information came in. Cold casework is full of people doing their jobs without knowing whether the answer will come next week, next year, or long after they retire. That uncertainty can be heavy. A detective might remember a case while driving home. A file might sit in the corner of the mind even when other work fills the day. You can imagine the feel of a steering wheel after a long shift, the smell of rain on the road, the soft green glow of dashboard numbers. The unanswered name rides along quietly. It doesn't need to be loud to remain present. For volunteers, the patience is different, but related. They may have no official authority, only time, care, and access to public information. They learn to compare carefully, to document sources, to avoid certainty before proof. The work can be emotionally delicate. Every possible match could be wrong. Every message to a family could cause pain if handled poorly. So the best volunteers move slowly. In Jason's case, that slow movement helped. The possible match was not just a passing thought left in a comment thread. It reached the people who could act. It moved toward official channels. It allowed DNA to do its work. You see how public attention and formal investigation can support each other when both are careful. Neither replaces the other. They meet. The case file becomes, in that sense, a meeting place between strangers and family, between old paper and new technology, between a road in Virginia and a home in South Carolina, between a nickname and a name. You can rest there a moment because the structure of the story is simple and deep. Something lost in one system was found through another. You turn another page and return to the physical experience of the file, because that is where sleep can settle. The paper makes a faint sound. The lamp pools light across the desk. The air may be cool against your hands. A pencil lies nearby, unused for now. You are not chasing anything. You are reading, noticing, and letting the evidence arrange itself at its own pace. The tickets lie near the beginning of the story, but by now they feel connected to everything after them. They are no longer just clues from a concert. They are the reason the public name formed. They are part of why the case remained memorable. They are evidence of presence, evidence of movement, evidence of a life that touched a crowd and then became separated from its own records. You might wonder how many people stood near Jason at those shows without ever knowing his name. That thought is not meant to trouble you. It is simply part of the human scale. We pass each other constantly. We share air, songs, lines, sidewalks, and highways. Most of those meetings leave no trace. Once in a while, a trace becomes important years later, and the ordinary past becomes evidence. The RFK Stadium shows themselves were large public events, filled with sound and motion. But in the case file, they become quiet points on a timeline. The 24th, the 25th, then the 26th in Virginia. Dates placed close together, you can see them written plainly. And the closeness has its own calm force. A weekend, a road, a file that would remain open for 2 decades. Numbers in a case file can feel cold until you remember what they measure. They measure days of travel, years of waiting, miles between agencies, time between last contact and identification. You read them slowly, because each number carries lived experience beneath it. 20 years is not just a span in a report. It is birthdays, seasons, moves, aging photographs, and questions asked in different rooms. In the old photographs of missing loved ones, Time can freeze unfairly. A family remembers a face at one age while everyone else continues to grow older. The missing person remains young in the picture. The people searching age around that image. In Jason Callahan's case, the return of his name also returned the truth that the young face belonged to a life deeply connected to others. You handle that gently, then move back to the investigative thread. The first stage was recognition of unidentified remains and preservation of details. The second was the public identity of Grateful Doe, built around the strange and memorable ticket evidence. The third was the long circulation of his image and description. The fourth was the possible match to Jason. The fifth was DNA confirmation. You do not list these as steps to hurry through them. You lay them out like smooth stones in a line, so the path is visible. Each stone has a texture. The first is official and careful. The second is personal and unusual. The third is communal and persistent. The fourth is intimate and uncertain. The fifth is scientific and final in the way identification can be final. Together they show how a case can move from unknown to known without ever needing noise. There is comfort in a sleep story in knowing that patient systems can work, even late, not perfectly, not always, but sometimes, after years, a file opens again and the right pieces meet. That comfort does not erase sorrow. It sits beside it. It says that care can continue beyond the first investigation, beyond the first unanswered year, beyond the point where most public attention drifts elsewhere. You can imagine the shelves of other cases nearby, some solved, some still waiting, each one with its own objects, photographs, and unfinished lines. The Grateful Doe file is one of the cases that found its name again, and that makes it a kind of lamp for the others. It shows that a preserved clue can matter later. It shows that visibility can matter. It shows that a family's long question can be answered. The weirdness of the evidence also helped the public remember the humanity of the case. People respond to specific things. A generic description may slide past the mind, but two Grateful Dead tickets in a young man's pocket create a vivid image, and that image invites care. You can see how the mind holds it, not as entertainment, but as a small, concrete truth that refuses to vanish. Concrete truths are important in cold case storytelling. They keep us from floating into abstraction, so we return to them often. The date was late June, the place was near Emporia. The road was Interstate 95. The shows were at RFK Stadium. The young man was unidentified for 20 years. His name was Jason Callahan. The evidence, patient and peculiar, helped bring him home to his own name. You might notice the rhythm of those facts as you read them. They are steady. They do not need embellishment. They carry the story on their own. Around them, we add atmosphere only to help you remain beside the file, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of time without being pulled into fear. The case deserves calm. In the long middle years, the file's quietness may have been its hardest feature. Nothing dramatic happens in a waiting file. No new lead for months, perhaps longer. No sudden clarity, just the same details, preserved and available. This can be difficult for people outside investigation to understand. Waiting is not always neglect. Sometimes, waiting is what a case must do until a new tool, new witness, or new comparison becomes possible. That doesn't mean waiting is easy. It can feel like failure from the outside. It can feel like abandonment to families. Investigators know this, and the best ones carry that knowledge with humility. You can imagine someone reopening the folder years later, aware that the paper has been quiet too long, and still beginning again with the first detail. Age, clothing, tickets, location, reconstruction. Beginning again is one of the main acts of cold case work. You read the same old report with new eyes. You ask whether a database now contains something it did not contain before. You ask whether DNA can be extracted or compared. You ask whether a public post might reach someone who was unreachable years ago. You don't assume the old silence means permanent silence. The Grateful Doe case rewards that kind of beginning again. It shows that the same evidence can gain meaning later. The tickets meant one thing in 1995. They meant another thing when shared online. They meant another thing after Jason was identified. Evidence is stable, but interpretation can grow as context gathers around it. You can feel that growth almost physically, like adding pages to a folder. At first, the tickets are noted. Later, they become part of a nickname. Later still, they draw a community's attention. Then, after identification, they become part of the story of how strangers remembered Jason before they knew his name. The object has not changed, but the circle around it has widened. A cold case file can be like that. It is not only a container of facts, it is a record of changing knowledge. Each new page alters the meaning of the pages before it. Once Jason's name entered the file, all earlier details arranged themselves differently. The unknown passenger became a known young man from South Carolina. The ticket stubs became not just clues, but fragments of his last known movements. You may imagine writing his name carefully in a notebook beside the old nickname, Jason Callahan. Grateful Doe. One real name, one public placeholder. The pencil pressure is light, the page feels smooth under your hand. You don't cross anything out harshly. You simply let the true name stand in front, where it belongs. The case also speaks to the importance of families continuing to search in whatever ways they can. Families may not always know where to look, especially when the missing person crossed state lines or lived a mobile life. They may have limited resources, limited information, or no clear agency to call. Their search can become a patchwork of phone calls, memories, old photographs, and hope. The official world may not always meet that hope cleanly. When a family finally receives confirmation, there can be relief mixed with grief, and grief mixed with exhaustion. You can imagine papers on a kitchen table, a phone placed face down, the room quiet after a long conversation. The answer has arrived. It is not the answer anyone wanted years earlier, but it ends one kind of uncertainty. That matters. For Jason's mother, the identification meant that the young man in the public file was no longer a distant unknown. He was her son. That single fact changes how every line should be read. It asks the listener to soften. It asks the investigator to remember that behind every evidence tag is a relationship. A file may be official, but the person inside it was loved outside the file. The online followers of the case had to make that shift too. Their mystery had become someone's confirmed loss. The respectful response is quiet. Update the page. Use the name. Stop treating the nickname as the center. Let the family's reality have more weight than the public's curiosity. In a contemplative case like this, that is part of the ethical work. You can see why this story belongs to patient detective work rather than spectacle. The identification did not come from a dramatic confrontation. It came from people looking, preserving, comparing, and waiting. It came from evidence strange enough to be remembered and ordinary enough to be human. It came from science used carefully. It came from a mother who could recognize what others could only approximate. As the night deepens, the file seems quieter on the desk. The lamp's circle narrows. The pages no longer feel like a stack of unanswered questions, but like a record of how an answer slowly approached. You are still reading, still turning the pages, but the pace has become softer. The case is no longer asking you to find Jason. It is asking you to understand how he was found. Understanding takes longer than knowing. Knowing says Jason Callahan was identified after 20 years. Understanding sits with the ticket stubs, the highway, the online posts, the DNA, the family recognition, and the long silence between them. It notices how many conditions had to align. It notices how much care can be hidden inside plain work. It notices that evidence can wait without forgetting. The Grateful Doe case is often remembered for the tickets because they are memorable, and that memory is fair. But as you sit longer, you see that the case was solved by a network of patience. The tickets drew attention. The records preserved identity markers. The community kept the case visible. The family connection brought a possible name. DNA confirmed it. No single piece had to carry the whole weight alone. That may be the gentlest way to understand weird evidence. It does not have to be miraculous. It only has to be kept, noticed, and joined to other facts. A ticket stub is fragile by itself. In a preserved file, shared with care, and later connected to science, it becomes part of a bridge. You can rest with that image. A bridge built from small things. The bridge took years to cross. On one side was an unidentified young man near a Virginia highway. On the other was Jason Callahan, remembered by people who loved him. Between them lay paper, images, systems, strangers, investigators, and time. Each step across was quiet. Each step mattered. And when the crossing was complete, the old name Grateful Doe could finally loosen its hold. But we don't leave the file yet. Not while there are still details to handle gently. You turn to the way public memory formed around the case, because that too is evidence of a kind, though not the kind sealed in plastic. Public memory kept repeating the essential facts until they reached further than the original bulletin could have reached. Repetition, when done respectfully, can be a form of care. The words Grateful Doe traveled easily because they held contrast, gratitude and uncertainty, music and loss, a community name and an unknown identity. The phrase was simple enough to remember and strange enough to ask about. Someone might hear it once, then look up the case later. That small act added one more set of eyes. In old mysteries, the title of a case can matter, not because a nickname solves anything, but because memory needs a doorway. The nickname opened that doorway. It led people to the ticket stubs, then to the reconstruction, then to the known circumstances, then to possible matches. You can feel the path of attention moving quietly from word to image to fact. Still, once Jason was identified, the doorway was no longer the room. The room belonged to him. Jason Callahan is the name that matters now. The Grateful Doe case remains the public path by which many people learn the story. But the person at the center stands beyond the nickname. You keep both truths with care because both are part of the record. There is a lesson here for anyone reading old case files. Use the public name when you need to find the record. Use the real name when you speak of the person. It is a small distinction, but small distinctions are often where respect lives. The file itself teaches that. It spent years trying to replace a description with a name. Once the name is known, the description should step back. You can imagine an index card being updated. The old label remains somewhere in the history, but the main line changes. Jason Callahan. Identified. The handwriting may be ordinary. The card may be plain. Yet the act is deeply human. It says the search did not end in a theory. It ended in a name returned. The air in the archive room feels cooler now. Maybe the hour is late. Maybe the building's heating system has settled into a low nighttime rhythm. You can hear the paper as you stack it neatly, though you are not closing it yet. The story continues through the people who learned from it, through other cases where small objects are now handled with even greater care. Investigators and volunteers looking at another unidentified person might remember Jason's case and pause over an object that seems minor. A ticket, a patch, a handmade bracelet, a receipt from a gas station, a piece of paper with a name that could be nickname or place. The lesson is not that every object will solve a case. The lesson is that no object should be dismissed too quickly. Context can arrive late. A receipt may not matter until a store location is understood. A bracelet may not matter until a photograph shows someone wearing it. A ticket may not matter until a community recognizes the event. Evidence can be quiet because its audience has not yet appeared. Patient detective work keeps the evidence ready. You turn that idea over slowly, and it feels central to the Grateful Doe case. The right audience for the ticket stubs included investigators, yes, but also music fans, online sleuths, family members, and eventually scientists connecting the identity. The clue had more than one audience across time. Each audience heard something different in it. For the first investigators, the ticket said recent travel and possible origin. For the public, they said this young man belonged to a recognizable scene. For online communities, they said the case had specific search terms and a memorable profile. For Jason's family, once the connection formed, they became part of the final path that explained where he had been. The same paper spoke in layers. Layered evidence is common in old files. A photograph is first documentation, then public appeal, then family recognition, then historical record. A fingerprint is first procedure, then later searchable data. A DNA sample is first preservation, then future possibility, then identification. Time changes what a clue can do if the clue survives. That survival is not abstract. It depends on storage, funding, habits, training, and care. Evidence rooms are not magical places. They are managed by people. They require space, labels, climate, policies, and attention. You can imagine boxes stacked on shelves, each one containing a life's unresolved question. The room may smell of cardboard and dust, but it is also full of responsibility. The Grateful Doe evidence survived long enough to meet a world prepared to understand it. That is a quiet success. It may not undo the sorrow of the case, but it matters. It means the original work was not wasted. It means the file remained able to speak. It means Jason's name could be confirmed instead of only suspected. As you read deeper, you may notice that the case has no single loud moment. Even the identification, powerful as it was, arrived through process. A possible match, family awareness, DNA testing, confirmation, public update. Each stage had to be handled carefully. The calmness of that process is one reason the story fits the quiet study of old mysteries. It shows how answers can come without spectacle. There is also a kind of tenderness in the delay, though delay itself is painful. Over 20 years, many people had time to care about Grateful Doe. When Jason was identified, those people had to learn to shift from mystery to remembrance. They had to let the case become less about their question and more about his name. That shift is a small moral education inside the story. You can feel it tonight as you sit with the file. Curiosity brought you here, but compassion keeps you here properly. The evidence is interesting, yes. The ticket stubs are unusual. The online path is striking. But the center is always Jason Callahan, and the patient effort to return him to his family's knowledge. Everything else is secondary. The file would not say it that way. Files do not speak with warmth. They state facts in lines and fields. But you, as the quiet detective beside the lamp, can read the warmth underneath. You can see the human labor behind the records. You can sense the family's long wait behind the confirmed name. You can hold the ordinary objects without turning them into ornaments. Slow enough to feel, careful enough to respect, specific enough to remain true. You stay inside the evidence, but you let the person remain larger than the evidence. Jason was not a ticket stub, or a shirt, or a reconstruction. Those things helped lead back to him, and then they became part of the path rather than the destination. The next page returns to the timeline, and you trace it without rushing. The shows at RFK Stadium took place on the 24th and 25th of June. The crash near Emporia occurred on the 26th. The identification came 20 years later. Between those dates lies the long unrecorded middle, where official silence and private searching existed side by side. Timelines can seem simple when written after the fact. They hide the confusion of living through events without knowing where they lead. In 1995, nobody reviewing the evidence could know that the answer would wait until 2015. They could only work the case in front of them. That humility is important. We know the ending of the identification now, but they did not. So you try to read the early file without judging it by later knowledge. You notice what they had. You notice what they lacked. You notice that the internet was not yet the vast connective space it would become. You notice that DNA tools were not used in the same broad way. You notice that a young traveler without identification could become very hard to name, even with sincere effort. That does not remove all questions about process. Cold cases often reveal gaps in systems, and those gaps deserve attention. But tonight, we keep the tone gentle and focused. The lesson is not blame. The lesson is care, preservation, and the importance of building better ways for missing and unidentified records to meet. Jason's case shows why those systems matter. You might imagine a modern investigator looking back and thinking how differently the case might move today. Social media posts could circulate within hours. Ticket records might be different. DNA comparison could begin sooner. Databases could be searched more widely. Families could share photographs instantly. Yet even today, cases can still wait because people's lives remain complicated and systems remain imperfect. That is why patience is not obsolete. Technology helps, but patience still holds the work together. Someone must interpret, verify, contact, compare, and preserve. Someone must slow down enough to avoid false certainty. Someone must remember that speed is not the same as care. The Grateful Doe case remains relevant because it combines old evidence with newer patients. The word solved can be simple, but here it deserves softness. Solved means identified. It means Jason Callahan's name was restored. It does not mean every question about the final days has been answered. It does not mean the family's grief ended. It means one central unknown was resolved, and that resolution matters. You hold the word solved like something delicate, not like a trophy. The weird evidence that helps solve the case did what evidence is supposed to do. It connected a present question to a past fact. It survived long enough for others to interpret it. It remained specific when memory blurred. It gave people a way to keep searching. You can sit with that and feel how quietly powerful ordinary objects can become. Now the old file is almost breathing with the room. The pages do not move, but your attention moves through them. The lamp makes a soft oval over the desk. Somewhere beyond the room, the world continues with its own night sounds. A car passing, a pipe settling, a faint rustle at the window. The case remains calm under your hands. You return once more to the image of RFK Stadium after the shows. The crowd thinning, paper cups underfoot, warm air over concrete, people looking for rides, friends, bags, exits, voices calling first names, vans starting, engines idling, a young man with tickets in his pocket, moving through a night that nobody yet knows will become part of a case file. You do not need to imagine too much, just enough to understand why the evidence felt alive. Those tickets were close to the last known movement. They carried the dust of a real weekend. They connected Jason to a place where many people had seen many faces and remembered only some of them. They made the search both more hopeful and more difficult. Hopeful because someone might remember. Difficult because memory in a crowd is fragile. A face seen briefly can blur into others. A name heard once can disappear. A ride offered casually may not leave any record. You can feel investigators trying to hold mist in their hands, using paper evidence as the container. The online community tried something similar years later, but with new tools. They held images and dates together, asking whether anyone recognized the pattern. They widened the search beyond the limitations of one office. They kept the face visible. You might picture someone saving the page, returning to it months later, noticing a comment they had missed before. The work was slow but not empty. When the possible Jason Callahan connection appeared, the case entered its most delicate phase. A possible name is not a restored name. It must be treated with care, because hope can hurt when it is wrong. The responsible path moves through verification. You can imagine the quiet restraint of that period, when people who cared about the case had to wait for confirmation rather than declare certainty. Waiting for DNA is a particular kind of waiting. It has the shape of science, but the emotional weight of family. Samples move through controlled procedures, results are generated and reviewed. Reports are written, but behind those steps, someone is waiting to learn whether an old absence has finally been located. The sterile lab and the human heart are part of the same process. When confirmation came, the public learned what the family had needed to know most. Grateful Doe was Jason Callahan. The sentence is simple, and perhaps that is why it carries so much. You can say it softly. You can let the name take its place. The file, after all those years, had found the line it was missing. And still, because we are continuing through the night and not closing the folder, there is more to notice about how the case changed after identification. The public pages had to be updated. Discussions had to shift. Articles and databases had to replace the unknown with the known. Some people who had followed the case for years had to adjust their memory because the nickname had become familiar. The true name needed to become familiar too. That transition is part of respect. It takes practice to change how a case lives in public language. People may still search the old phrase because that is how the record was known, but the story should lead them to Jason. The nickname becomes a doorway into the history of the search. The name becomes the room where we sit. You can imagine someone finding the case years after identification. They might first encounter the phrase Grateful Doe, then learn the name Jason Callahan, then read about the ticket stubs and the online search. Their experience is different from those who followed the case before it was solved. They are spared the uncertainty, but they can still learn from the patients. For that later reader, the evidence may seem almost destined. Of course, the tickets mattered. Of course, the online community noticed. Of course, DNA confirmed it. But when you slow down, you understand it was not destiny, it was preservation and effort. The answer could have been missed. The evidence could have been mishandled. The post might not have reached the right person. The comparison might not have been made. That awareness makes the case more moving, not less. It shows how fragile resolution can be. A solved cold case is not only a solved puzzle, it is also a story of many chances that finally aligned. You hold that without alarm. You simply let it deepen your appreciation for the people who kept looking. The phrase patient detective work includes professionals, but it also includes every careful person who treats evidence and memory responsibly. A detective in an office, a records clerk entering details, a forensic artist drawing a face, a volunteer maintaining a page, a family member sharing DNA, a lab technician processing samples. Each one contributes to the eventual return of a name. You can see them as points of light along the timeline. None of them needs to be bright alone. Together, they mark the path. The Grateful Doe case becomes visible through that line of small lights stretching from 1995 to 2015, from Virginia to South Carolina, from paper tickets to genetic confirmation. The sensory world of that timeline keeps you grounded. Heat on the highway, dust in a stadium lot, paper ticket stock under a thumb, fluorescent light in an evidence room, the dry smell of old folders, the quiet glow of a computer screen, the clean chill of a lab, the familiar stillness of a family home after a difficult phone call. These are the textures of the case. They remind you that investigation is not abstract. It happens in rooms, on roads, at desks, in labs, and in the minds of people who cannot quite let a question go. You, tonight, are one of those quiet readers. You are not rushing to the answer. You are tracing how the answer became possible, one ordinary object at a time. The ticket stubs remain at the center, but they no longer stand alone. They are joined by the culture of the shows, the mobility of young fans, the route through Virginia, the public nickname, the reconstruction, the databases, the online discussion, the family recognition, and the DNA test. The case is a braid of all these strands. Pulling one strand helps you see the others. A braid is a gentle image for this file. It does not depend on force. It depends on repeated crossing. Evidence crosses memory. Memory crosses technology. Technology crosses family knowledge. Family knowledge crosses official procedure. The result is stronger than any single thread. Jason's identification came from that woven patience. You sit with the braid in your hands, metaphorically, and let it rest there. The night is quiet enough for small thoughts. Somewhere in the file, the old tickets are still what they always were. 2 pieces of paper from 2 evenings in June. But around them now is a full story of how small things can endure. The next page may be a public notice, or a database printout, or a copied article. It matters less than the rhythm of continuing. You turn it because old cases deserve to be read past the famous detail. The ticket stubs brought many people to the Grateful Doe case, but the full story asks you to stay long enough to see the wider work. It asks for the patience it describes. And so you stay with the wider work. You think of the first responders and investigators near Emporia doing the immediate tasks required by the day. You think of the evidence being gathered and labeled. You think of the unidentified young man being described as carefully as possible. You think of the early hope that someone would call soon with a name. In many cases, that call comes quickly. Here, it did not. When early answers do not arrive, a case changes character. It moves from urgent identification to long-term uncertainty. The paperwork grows, the public notices go out. The details become standardized, repeated, and sometimes reduced. That reduction is practical, but it can make a person feel distant. The ticket stubs resisted that distance. They kept a trace of lived experience inside the formal description. That may be why people responded to Grateful Doe so strongly. He did not feel like an abstraction. He felt like someone who had just been in the crowd, just been on the road, just been carrying remnants of a weekend. The evidence narrowed the emotional distance. It allowed strangers to care without pretending they knew him. Caring from a distance should remain humble. You can care about Jason's identification while knowing that the deepest grief was not yours. You can be grateful for the solved case while knowing that resolution arrived late. You can learn from the evidence without making it decorative. This humility keeps the tone steady and respectful. The file, in its quiet way, teaches that too. It does not ask for performance, it asks for attention. Read the dates, preserve the objects, share the image carefully, check the possible match, wait for confirmation, use the real name. Let the family have the center. These are simple actions, but they form an ethic. As you continue reading, your own breathing may slow with the page turns. The case has already given its central answer, so there is no need for tension. What remains is contemplation. How ordinary things survive, how systems improve, how strangers help, how families wait, how a name can return after years when the right evidence meets the right care. The Grateful Doe case, then, is not only about weird evidence that solved a mystery, it is about why weird evidence mattered at all. It mattered because it made the unknown specific. It mattered because specificity is searchable. It mattered because searchable details can be shared. It mattered because shared details can reach someone with memory. It mattered because memory can lead to science. It mattered because science can restore a name. That chain is quiet enough to miss if you look only for dramatic moments. But tonight, we are looking for the quiet chain. You can see each link. The paper ticket, the public post, the family recognition, the DNA sample, the updated record. Each link is simple. Together they hold, there is something almost restful about a case that teaches patience after it has been solved. You are not waiting in the same way the investigators once waited. You are learning how waiting worked. You are letting the file show you its pace. You are allowing the small evidence to remain small, even while acknowledging that it helped carry a very large human answer. The night around the desk feels deeper now. The lamp seems warmer by contrast. If you lift the corner of a page, the shadow beneath it shifts slightly. The old paper smell is still there, mixed with the faint dryness of the rue. You can imagine a pencil mark in the margin beside Jason's name. Not because the fact is uncertain, but because it is important. Importance in a file is often marked quietly, an underline, a sticky note, a copied page placed near the front, a case status changed. These gestures are modest. They suit this story. The answer came not as noise, but as a correction to the record, a restoration of truth where uncertainty had been. You may wonder about the people who first called him Grateful Doe. They likely wanted a way to speak of him with kindness. The name linked him to the most distinctive clue, but also to a feeling of gentleness around the case. It is possible to be grateful that a name held public attention while still being glad it was eventually replaced. That balance is part of the story's maturity. Jason's real name is not a clue. It is the person. The clues point toward it. Once you understand that, the file becomes easier to hold respectfully. You can study the evidence without letting the evidence eclipse him. You can speak of the ticket stubs as important, while remembering that their importance lies in the way they helped restore Jason Callahan to his own history. The road, the tickets, the shirt, the reconstructions, the databases, the online posts, the DNA result, all of these now settle into place around the name. The file is still detailed, but less lonely. It no longer asks who he was in the most basic sense. It tells you. Then it lets you consider how long and carefully the answer had to travel. You keep turning the pages, because this is where the sleep story continues, in the afterlife of evidence and the habits of patient work. Cases like this change how people look at the next folder. They remind investigators to preserve unusual personal items. They remind volunteers to share respectfully. They remind the public that a strange detail might matter, but only when joined with verification. They remind families that old questions can sometimes still be answered. No one lesson is enough. The file offers many small ones. Preserve, compare, share carefully, wait responsibly, verify, use the name. Let compassion guide curiosity. You do not need to recite them like rules. You can feel them in the way the case unfolded, slowly and with many hands. The evidence box, if you picture it now, is no longer just a container. It is a time capsule of everything investigators once knew and everything later generations would need. The tickets inside it came from a loud place, but their later work was silent. The silence did not mean nothing was happening. It meant the evidence was waiting for its next reader. Tonight, that next reader is you, in the quiet, imagined room with the old Grateful Doe file open and Jason Callahan's name written clearly where it belongs. You are not solving the case anew. You are learning how it was solved and learning perhaps how patience leaves traces of its own, a careful label, a preserved ticket, a shared image, a family connection, a scientific result. The file does not ask you to be restless. It asks you to notice how the paper feels, to notice how dates line up, to notice how a nickname can hold attention but not identity, to notice how a small clue can travel through decades, to notice how many people are needed to return one name. And as you notice, the case keeps unfolding in the same quiet way, page after page, not toward a loud ending, but deeper into the patient work that made the answer possible. The next page feels newer than the others, as if it came from a printer long after the first reports had settled into their folders. The paper is brighter, the edges sharper, and the language belongs to a different era of investigation, where public databases and online discussions had become part of the search. You can feel the old Grateful Doe case stretching across time, carrying evidence from one kind of world into another. It is still the same file, but the room around it has changed. In the earlier years, the case would have moved by phone call, bulletin, fax, and mailed photograph. You can imagine a detective standing by a machine that clicked and warmed as it sent a reconstruction to another office. The paper might curl slightly as it emerged. The image might lose detail with each copy. Still, that was how information traveled, slowly and materially, from one desk to another. Later, the same image could appear on a screen within seconds. That did not make the answer instant. It only made the circle wider. A person in another state, awake late and reading about unidentified cases, could see the young man called Grateful Doe and pause over his face. You can imagine the room around that person, dim except for the monitor, with a glass of water leaving a ring on the desk. The widening circle mattered because Jason Callahan's life had crossed more than one place. South Carolina, Washington, D.C., Virginia, and the larger traveling community around the shows all belonged to the search in different ways. A local file alone could hold facts, but it could not easily reach every person who might recognize him. The internet became a kind of hallway between those rooms. People moved information through it, sometimes clumsily, sometimes carefully, but often with real concern. You can hear the difference between an official bulletin and an online thread. The bulletin is concise, structured, and restrained. The thread breathes differently, with questions, comparisons, corrections, and small human reactions. Both can serve a purpose. The file needs the bulletin's accuracy. The public search needs the thread's reach. In the Grateful Doe case, those two forms of attention slowly began to support each other. That support was not automatic. It required people to be cautious with what they thought they saw. Resemblance can be persuasive in the soft light of hope. A jawline looks close. A hairstyle feels familiar. An age range seems right enough. But right enough is not identification, and you can sense the importance of that distinction as you sit with the case. The file asks for tenderness, but also discipline. Discipline means letting evidence remain evidence, and letting guesses remain guesses. It means using phrases like possible match, not certainty, until the right testing has been done. It means remembering that a family may be on the other side of a message, and that hope should never be handled roughly. The people who helped move Jason's case forward had to cross that delicate ground. They had to care without rushing. The Grateful Doe case is a good place to learn that kind of care, because the evidence was so evocative. The tickets invited imagination. The clothing invited recognition. The reconstructed face invited comparison. Yet the final answer came only when the possible identity became testable. You can feel the balance there, like holding a thin page by both corners so it doesn't crease. Human attention on one side, scientific confirmation on the other. As you read, the passage of 20 years becomes almost physical. It is not just a number in the margin. It is the aging of photographs, the changing of computers, the retirement of investigators, the growth of new databases, and the long persistence of family memory. You can imagine an old office computer replaced by another, then another, while the case information is moved forward each time. The file survives these changes quietly. There is something humbling about old evidence meeting new technology. The ticket stubs did not become more advanced. They remained paper. The shirt did not transform. The reconstruction did not suddenly become exact. What changed was the world's ability to connect those details. You sit with that and feel how often progress in cold cases comes from connection, not replacement. The old clue does not disappear. It finally finds company. The company, in Jason's case, included public memory. People remembered Grateful Doe because the case had a name that stayed in the mind. They remembered the Grateful Dead connection because it was unusual and specific. They remembered the face because it had been shared again and again. This memory created a kind of unofficial watchfulness, spread out across many ordinary lives. You can picture it like small lamps in many windows. One lamp might be a volunteer who updates a case page after work. Another might be a music fan who knows the travel patterns around those shows. Another might be someone who has followed unidentified person cases for years and notices a possible connection. Another might be a family member who sees an image and feels the air change. No one lamp lights the whole road, but together they let the path appear. The official record remains central, of course. Without preserved evidence and proper confirmation, the public memory could not finish the work. But without public attention, the possible name may not have moved toward the right people when it did. That is the quiet partnership inside this case. It is imperfect, human, and deeply modern. Old evidence waited until a newer form of community could carry it farther. You turn the page, and the story settles again into the question of recognition. Recognition is not the same as proof, but it can be the moment that makes proof possible. A mother may know the shape of her child's face in ways no database can capture. She may recognize a set of features even through the imperfect veil of a reconstruction. You can imagine how careful that recognition must be, how painful, how uncertain at first. It is not a simple moment. It opens a door into waiting. The room where such recognition happens might be completely ordinary. A kitchen table, a living room, a computer desk, the smell of coffee or laundry, light from a window falling across the floor. Then an image appears, and the ordinary room becomes part of a case that began years before on a Virginia highway. You can feel how the public and private worlds suddenly touch. For the family, the name Grateful Doe was never the most important thing. Jason was. The nickname belonged to the years when others did not know him. The family's memory belonged to the years before and during that uncertainty. When the two met, the old public mystery had to make room for private truth. You sit with that softly, because it is one of the most human movements in the file. The testing that followed was quiet but decisive. DNA can feel almost abstract when spoken of casually, but in a case like this, it is a bridge made from biology and trust. Someone provides a sample, someone processes it, someone compares it, someone reviews the result, then the language of possibility changes into the language of identification. The file, after years of careful uncertainty, receives a name it can stand on. You can imagine the report arriving, or being read, or being entered into the record. There may have been no dramatic sound at all, just a phone call, a printed page, a signature, a line of text that made the old case different forever. Jason Callahan. The name does not need ornament. It carries enough on its own. The file becomes both heavier and lighter. Heavier because the unknown young man is now fully connected to a family's loss. Lighter because the long absence of a name has ended. This is how identification often feels in old cases. Relief and sorrow do not cancel each other. They sit side by side like two folders on the same desk. You can hold them both without forcing either one away. The Grateful Duo case asks for that kind of holding. It asks you to be glad that Jason was named, and to remain aware that the naming came after many years. It asks you to value the evidence, but not forget the person. It asks you to admire the patience without making the delay feel acceptable or simple. The tone remains calm, because calmness can leave room for complexity. As the file moves into the period after identification, the public record begins to change. Pages that once described an unidentified male now include Jason's name. Discussions that once asked who he was now reflect on how he was found. The ticket stubs remain famous, but they are placed inside a completed identification rather than an open question. You can feel the case shifting from search to remembrance. That shift has its own paperwork. Updates must be made. Case listings must be changed. Agencies must close or amend records. Public pages must avoid leaving the old uncertainty standing where the truth is now known. These are small administrative acts, but they matter. A person's name deserves to follow them through the systems that once could not hold it. You can imagine someone opening an old web page and adding the identification date, then pausing before saving. The cursor blinks. The room is quiet. Outside, life continues with ordinary sounds. A dog barking far away, a car door closing, rain in a gutter. Inside, a record becomes more accurate. That small correction is one of the final gifts of patient investigation. Yet the evidence still teaches, even after the central answer, the ticket stubs continue to be discussed because they show how unusual clues can keep a case alive in public attention. The online path continues to be studied because it shows how respectful communities can help. The DNA confirmation continues to matter because it shows why science must anchor recognition. You can revisit each lesson without reopening the uncertainty. The file becomes almost educational in the gentlest sense. It shows future investigators why personal effects deserve careful documentation. It shows volunteers why sharing details accurately matters. It shows families why old images and missing person information can still have power years later. It shows listeners like you why the smallest evidence should be handled with patience. Patience is not passive here. It is active, steady, and alert. It preserves the ticket instead of discarding it. It posts the reconstruction again without exaggeration. It checks a possible match instead of announcing it too soon. It waits for DNA instead of relying on resemblance. It updates the name once the answer is confirmed. Each act is quiet, and each act is work. You can almost hear that work as a low rhythm beneath the case. The soft sliding of a file drawer, the tap of keys, the hum of fluorescent lights, the sealed whisper of an evidence bag, the muted ring of a phone in an office, the breath someone takes before making a difficult call. Nothing in that rhythm is sudden. It is the sound of people continuing. Continuing matters because many cold cases do not reward attention quickly. A person can spend hours comparing records and find nothing. An agency can submit information and wait. A family can share photographs and receive no immediate answer. The work may appear still from the outside, but inside it there is movement, small and persistent. The Grateful Doe case moved that way for years. The passage from 1995 to 2015 contains many changes in American life, but the file carries them quietly. In the beginning, information moved through older channels. By the end, social media and online sleuthing had become part of the landscape. DNA testing had become more powerful and more commonly applied. Public awareness of unidentified person cases had grown. Jason's evidence crossed that changing landscape without losing its meaning. You might picture the ticket stubs like leaves pressed inside a book. The book stays closed for years. When it opens again, the leaves are dry and fragile, but still recognizable. They carry the shape of the season they came from. In the same way, the tickets carried June of 1995 forward into a later world. They were fragile, but they were enough to keep part of the path visible. The path through the Grateful Dead community is especially distinct. This was not just any concert. It belonged to a culture with its own memories, roots, and patterns of travel. Fans often moved from show to show, sometimes with loose plans and shifting companions. That context made the tickets both helpful and complicated. They narrowed the timeline, while widening the number of people who might have crossed Jason's path. You can imagine investigators trying to enter that context from the outside. They may have understood the basic facts, but not every nuance of the community. Later, People familiar with that world could read the evidence differently. They could understand how someone might move between Washington and points south. They could understand casual rides, parking lot conversations, and the way names might remain partial. This kind of cultural knowledge can matter. Evidence is never just evidence in isolation. It belongs to a setting. A ticket from a reserved theater seat suggests one kind of movement. A festival wristband suggests another. A highway receipt suggests another. The Grateful Doe ticket suggested not only location and date, but a social world around those dates. That social world became part of how people searched. Still, the social world could not identify him by itself. It created possibilities. It created memory prompts. It helped keep the case visible. But official confirmation required the tools of identification. The lesson is balance again. You use context to guide the search, and you use science to secure the answer. One without the other may not be enough. You turn the page and notice how often balance appears in this case. Public and private, old and new, memory and documentation, nickname and real name, curiosity and respect, possibility and proof. Each pair has to be held carefully, with neither side allowed to overwhelm the other. That is why the story remains calm. It is a study in balance as much as a study in evidence. The file's calmness does not mean it lacks emotion. It means the emotion is given room to breathe. You can feel sadness in the long wait, tenderness in the restored name, gratitude for the people who kept looking, and humility before the limits of what can be known. None of these feelings needs to rise sharply. They can settle like dust in lamplight, visible only when you slow down. As you sit longer with Jason's case, the phrase weird evidence becomes less strange. All evidence is a little strange when removed from ordinary life and placed in a file. A shirt no longer keeps someone warm. A ticket no longer opens a gate. A photograph no longer sits in a family album. Each object is taken from its first purpose and asked to help answer a question. That transformation is quiet, but profound. The tickets had been made for a single evening's admission. Their printed dates were meant to guide event staff, not investigators. Their value was supposed to expire at the door, but years later, they still had work to do. You can hold that thought gently. Some objects outlive their intended purpose because life asks them to carry memory in ways nobody planned. A cold case file is full of such unintended carriers. Receipts, bus passes, letters, clothing tags, and handwritten notes can become anchors. They may not reveal a name immediately, but they place a person in the world. They say, here is one point where this life touched something traceable. In Jason's case, the ticket stubs gave that point a vivid form. You can imagine someone in an evidence room decades later lifting the envelope and reading the label. The paper inside is handled carefully, perhaps photographed again, perhaps described again, for updated records. The room is quiet, except for the soft mechanical sound of ventilation. The person reviewing it may know the case has already been identified, but the evidence still deserves the same care. It remains part of the truth. Truth in cold cases is often assembled after long separation. One piece is held by an agency, one by a family, one by a public memory, one by a laboratory. The work is to bring them into relation. That is what happened here. The Grateful Doe case did not hinge only on a strange clue. It depended on the eventual meeting of pieces that had waited apart. You might think of the family's photographs as another kind of evidence, though more intimate than official exhibits. A photograph held at home carries warmth that a case file cannot reproduce. It may show Jason in a way the reconstruction never could, with motion, expression, personality, and the surrounding signs of a life. When those personal images were compared to the public image, another bridge formed. That bridge could not stand alone, but it mattered. It gave investigators a direction. It gave the family a reason to engage the official process. It gave the online community a possible answer to handle carefully. Then DNA made the bridge firm enough to cross. You can feel the sequence moving slowly, each stage waiting its turn. There is a quiet kindness in waiting your turn in a case like this. The public waits for confirmation. The family waits for official word. Investigators wait for results. No one benefits from rushing ahead of proof. In a world that often moves quickly, Old casework reminds you that some truths must arrive through proper channels, or they arrive damaged. Jason's name arrived through those channels. That is why we can say it calmly tonight. Not as speculation, not as a theory, as the restored identity of the young man once known publicly as Grateful Doe. The file no longer has to ask that primary question. It can now show how the question was answered. And as you keep reading, the case begins to feel less like a mystery and more like a record of care across time. The mystery was real, but care is what carried it. The driver's identification, the passenger's missing name, the ticket stubs, the highway, the reconstructions, the online attention, the family recognition, the DNA confirmation, all of it becomes part of a long act of attention. You can rest inside that act. The story also shows how a case can be both famous and intimate. Grateful Doe became well known among people who follow unidentified person cases. The nickname circulated widely, yet Jason himself was not a public symbol. He was a person from a family, with a life that cannot be reduced to the details that made his case known. Holding both truths is part of respectful narration. You can imagine two circles on a page. The outer circle is public attention, with forums, databases, articles, and case summaries. The inner circle is family memory, personal and private. The identification allowed the outer circle to point toward the inner one, but it did not give the public ownership of it. It simply corrected the record. That correction is enough. The old evidence now belongs to the history of the search. It can be studied, but gently. It can teach, but not consume. The tickets can be mentioned as unusual, but not treated as a novelty detached from the person they helped identify. The online search can be appreciated, but not turned into self-congratulation. The DNA can be respected as final proof, but not as a machine that worked without human care around it. Human care appears everywhere when you look slowly. Someone noticed the tickets, someone kept them, someone documented the clothing, someone made the reconstruction, someone entered the case into systems, someone shared it, someone saw a possible connection, someone in the family recognized something, someone tested, someone confirmed. The file is full of hands, most of them unseen. You can almost feel those hands as you turn the pages. Some hands are gloved in an evidence room, some rest on a computer mouse late at night, some hold an old family photograph, some type an update into a database. Some close a folder after a long day. The work is distributed, and that distribution is part of its strength. In a case solved after many years, no single moment contains all the meaning. The meaning is spread out like light across a long table. The early evidence collection matters. The quiet years matter. The public memory matters. The family's recognition matters. The DNA matters. You let your attention move from one pool of light to another without forcing them into a single bright point. This is how sleep can hold a mystery without turning it into fear. The focus stays on patience, not danger. On evidence, not harm. On names, not spectacle. On the slow human desire to set the record right. The Grateful Doe case allows that kind of focus because its resolution came through restoration. The answer returned something essential. You turn now toward the databases again because they were the shelves of the digital age. A database can seem sterile until you understand that it gives old cases a second life. It allows a record to be found by someone who never knew which county to call. It allows details to travel beyond jurisdiction. It allows a volunteer to search by age, date, location, clothing, and circumstance. It turns a paper file into something that can meet other paper files across distance. You can hear the quiet power in that. For Grateful Doe, online listings made the case accessible to people who might never have seen a local bulletin. The details became searchable. The RFK tickets became searchable. The image became shareable. Each of these things widened the chance that the right person would encounter the case. The widening happened slowly, but it changed the search. The act of entering information is easy to overlook, yet a missing date, a misspelled location, or a vague description can affect whether a case is found. You can imagine someone correcting an entry, adding a detail about the ticket stubs, or making sure the location near Emporia is clear. These small acts may feel like housekeeping, In cold casework, housekeeping can be a form of investigation. The Grateful Doe case benefited from being memorable, but memorability still needed structure. A person might remember the nickname and then use a database to find the details. A person might remember the tickets and search by event. A person might see the reconstruction and compare it to a missing loved one. Public memory and structured data work together, like two hands lifting the same box. That image suits the case. One hand alone might drop something fragile, two hands can steady it. The public hand brings attention, the official hand brings procedure, the scientific hand brings confirmation. Perhaps there are more than two hands in the end, all steadying the same fragile truth. You can picture them without needing to name every person. The sound of the search changes depending on the room. In an office, it is paper and phones. In a home, it is a keyboard and the low hum of appliances. In a lab, it is machines, sealed containers, and quiet voices. In a family space, it may be silence after difficult news. The case moves through all these soundscapes, and each one gives it a different kind of gravity. You stay with the home space for a moment because families hold time differently than files do. A file records when a person was found, when evidence was collected, when a report was entered. A family records birthdays, favorite habits, last conversations, and the ache of not knowing. When identification happens, those two forms of time meet. Official time and family time finally speak to each other. That meeting can be tender and painful. The official record may say identified in 2015. A mother's heart may say the waiting began long before that line was written. You read both truths together. The file gives you structure, but compassion gives you scale. Without compassion, the dates are too thin. The case of Jason Callahan reminds you that every unidentified person may have someone measuring time in that private way. Someone may be keeping a photograph. Someone may be remembering a voice. Someone may be wondering whether to keep asking or how to keep asking. The restoration of a name answers one part of that long private time, even if it cannot return what was lost. You turn the page slowly, and the case returns to the physical road. Interstate 95 near Emporia is a place of motion, not memory. For most people who pass through it, they stop for fuel, merge back into traffic, and continue south or north. The road surface holds heat in summer, and headlights make long white and red lines at night. It is not a place designed for lingering. Yet the Grateful Doe case asks you to linger there, quietly, because that road became part of Jason's story. Highways can make people anonymous. Cars pass too quickly. Travelers are between addresses. A person in a passenger seat may be seen by no one who can later say their name. This anonymity complicates investigation. It also gives the ticket stubs added meaning, because they tied the traveler to a recent place of gathering rather than leaving him only on the road. The van, too, belongs to that in-between world. Not a home exactly, not just transportation either. A vehicle carrying people, objects, and traces from one place to another. You can imagine dust on the floor, a map folded badly, the smell of fabric seats and sun-warmed air. Ordinary details, none of them dramatic, all of them part of the physical reality investigators had to examine. When investigators look at a vehicle after an incident, they are often looking for context as much as direct answers. What was inside? Where might it have been? Who might have been traveling? Were there papers, personal effects, belongings, or traces that tell a story of movement? In Jason's case, the most enduring context came from those tickets and the identity of the driver, but many small observations would have shaped the early report. The passenger's lack of identification made every other detail work harder. Clothing worked harder, physical description worked harder, tickets worked harder, the reconstruction worked harder. You can feel the strain placed on ordinary evidence when a wallet or official document is absent. The file has to build a person from fragments until a name can be found. Fragments can be enough if they are kept and later joined. That is the quiet hope under the case. No single fragment gave Jason back immediately, but the fragments did not vanish. They waited. They were described, shared, and eventually connected to family and DNA. The patience of fragments is one of the recurring themes in old casework. You might imagine placing each fragment on the desk, not as a dramatic display, but as a careful review. Ticket stubs, clothing description, hair color, estimated age, location, date, reconstruction, possible match, DNA, name. Your eyes move from one to the next. The desk is steady, the room is quiet. The order slowly makes sense. The order, though, was not so clear to those living through it. That is why hindsight must remain gentle. It is easy to see a solved case as inevitable after the answer appears. It was not inevitable. It depended on continued attention and the preservation of fragile clues. You remind yourself of that as you read, because it keeps gratitude realistic. Gratitude belongs in the case, but not in a loud way. Gratitude for the evidence being kept, gratitude for the people who shared the case respectfully, gratitude for the family who helped confirm the truth, gratitude for the technology that made confirmation possible, gratitude that Jason's name is known. These are quiet forms of gratitude, suited to a quiet room. The name Jason Callahan now changes how every previous detail sounds. The young man in the passenger seat was not only unidentified, he was Jason, the person with the tickets was Jason, the person represented by the reconstruction was Jason, the person strangers tried to name was Jason. You let the repetition settle, because it gently restores personhood where the file once had only descriptors. Personhood is the heart of unidentified person work. Not mystery for mystery's sake, but the return of personhood in official language. Unknown male becomes Jason Callahan. Grateful Doe becomes a historical nickname. Case details become part of a named life. The transformation is administrative, scientific, and emotional all at once. You can imagine the relief of correcting a label. Labels are small, but they shape how people are seen. An unknown label is necessary when nothing else is available, but it is also incomplete. Once the true label arrives, the file changes its posture. It no longer has to stand at the doorway asking who. It can open into the fuller human story, while still respecting what remains private. The fuller story is not ours to invent. We know the investigative path. We know the evidence. We know the identification. Beyond that, we move carefully. You can sense the boundary, and you honor it. This is a sleep narration about patient detective work, not an attempt to fill every silence. Some silences remain untouched because respect asks that they remain. What we can explore is the long path of the evidence, and there is still more to see there. The tickets were preserved as objects, then transformed into keywords. The phrase Grateful Doe became a searchable handle. The reconstruction became a shareable image. The possible match became an investigative lead. The DNA became confirmation. Each transformation changed the form of the evidence while keeping its purpose. Form matters. Paper reaches one audience, a scanned image reaches another, a database entry reaches another, a social media post reaches another, a lab profile reaches another. The same case can move through many forms, and each form can open a different door. In Jason's case, the doors open slowly, but eventually they open towards the right name. You may think of the case as a quiet relay. The first investigators carried it as far as their tools and information allowed. Later, custodians carried the record forward. Online communities carried the image and nickname into wider awareness. A possible match carried the case toward the Callahan family. DNA carried the final proof. The baton was not flashy. It was evidence, passed carefully. A relay can fail if someone drops what they are carrying. Here, enough people held on. That is worth noticing. The file itself is proof of continuity. Not perfect continuity, perhaps, but enough. Enough for a name to return after 20 years. Enough for the old ticket stubs to remain meaningful. Enough for Jason's family to receive confirmation rather than only rumor. The word enough feels modest, and maybe that is right. Cold case work often aims for enough certainty, enough preservation, enough attention to move forward. It may never recover every detail. It may never answer every emotional question, but enough can still be profound when the missing piece is a name. Enough can change a family's long uncertainty into a known truth. You sit with that modest profundity, and the room remains calm. The page edges are even under your hand. The lamp hums faintly. Or perhaps the hum is only the building around you. Your eyes move line by line. The case does not end here in your reading. It continues into what we learn from it, and into the way old evidence may be viewed by future investigators. Future investigators might see a concert ticket differently because of this case. Not as a novelty, but as a potential connector to an event, a crowd, a date, and a culture. They might document it with extra care. They might photograph both sides. They might note seat, venue, date, and condition. They might think about communities attached to the event. They might wonder who else was there. This kind of thinking is not overcomplication. It is context. Evidence without context can sit quietly for too long. Evidence with context can reach people. The Grateful Doe case shows how context turned paper into a public memory, and public memory into a path toward identification. The clue was small, but its context was wide. At the same time, future volunteers might learn to be careful with online attention. A memorable case can attract many eyes, and many eyes can bring both help and noise. The helpful work is slow, sourced, and respectful. It avoids harassing families. It avoids declaring matches without confirmation. It understands that behind every comparison are living people. Jason's identification shows the good that can happen when attention is guided by care. The family's role also teaches something. A relative's recognition may open the door, but scientific confirmation protects everyone involved. It protects the family from uncertainty. It protects the record from error. It protects the unidentified person's dignity by ensuring the name is correct. In a case where the public has been watching, that protection is especially important. You can feel how the case balances warmth and rigor again. Warmth kept people looking. Rigor made the identification trustworthy. Without warmth, the case might have faded from public view. Without rigor, the answer might have remained only a hopeful claim. Together they allowed Jason's name to be restored with confidence. The old file seems to approve of this balance, if a file can be imagined that way. Its pages are factual, but the path through them is humane. It contains objective details and emotional consequences. It contains objects that were catalogued and objects that were remembered. It contains the long space between not knowing and knowing. You read it as both document and human record. The sensory details keep you grounded as you continue. The slight roughness of copied paper, the smooth face of a printed photograph, the dull edge of a cardboard evidence box, the smell of dust warmed by a lamp, the coolness of a metal drawer handle, the faint tackiness of an old label. These ordinary sensations are the atmosphere of patient work. Patient work is rarely cinematic. It is more like tending. You return to the same thing, not because it changes each time, but because your understanding might. You water the same plant, you check the same shelf, you reread the same paragraph. In a cold case, a detail that once seemed inert can become meaningful after one new fact arrives. The file rewards return. Jason's file rewarded return in the deepest way. People returned to the ticket stubs, the face, the description, and the timeline until the possible match emerged. The case had to be seen repeatedly by different people in different contexts. It had to become familiar enough that someone could notice a resemblance or a pattern. Familiarity, handled well, became a tool. There is a risk in familiarity because people can grow attached to a case as an unsolved story. Identification asks them to let that version go. The Grateful Doe case required that letting go. Once Jason was named, the public story changed from who is he to how was he found, and then to how can this help others. That is the natural movement of a solved unidentified person case. You can feel that movement under the pages. The mystery does not vanish. It transforms into instruction and remembrance. The evidence does not lose importance. It gains settled meaning. The nickname does not disappear entirely. It becomes part of the history rather than the identity. Jason's name remains at the center, steady and clear. The next quiet thought is about time and technology again, because the case sits at their intersection. In 1995, the evidence was physical and local. By 2015, the search was digital and distributed. DNA gave the final answer, but the social path mattered too. The old and the new did not replace one another. They braided together. That braid is now part of how many cold cases are approached. Investigators may think about public appeals with more awareness. Volunteers may think about official verification with more respect. Families may know that older, unidentified person cases can still be searched. Labs may receive samples from cases that once seemed unlikely to resolve. Each improvement is built on earlier stories like this one. You do not need to leave Jason's file to feel that wider influence. It is present in the way the evidence now seems instructive. The ticket stubs are not only what Jason carried, they are also a reminder to future caseworkers that personal effects can carry social maps. The reconstruction is not only an image, it is a reminder that imperfect public images can still reach the right person. DNA is not only a result, it is a reminder that science can confirm what memory suspects. The quiet room holds all of that without becoming crowded. You can place each idea gently where it belongs. The file remains open. The lamp remains warm. Your breathing remains slow. The story continues through careful noticing rather than sudden movement. You may imagine, for a moment, the evidence envelope being opened after identification, perhaps for review or documentation. The tickets are no longer pleading for a name in quite the same way. They have been answered, yet they still carry the memory of the search. They are artifacts of a long wait, and a reminder that ordinary paper can become part of restoring someone's place in the world. There is a softness in answered evidence. Before identification, a clue seems to lean forward, asking. After identification, it settles back, understood. The same object, different posture. The tickets now say, this is how they remembered him. This is how they kept looking. This is one of the ways Jason Callahan came back into his name. You turn that phrase over, came back into his name, and it feels right for the file. The name had always been his. The world of records simply had to find its way to it. That journey took 20 years, and the journey matters because it reveals the limits and possibilities of investigation. A name can be present in one world and absent in another until evidence creates a bridge. The bridge in this case crossed not only distance, but also language. Unknown male, Grateful Doe, Jason Callahan. Each phrase belongs to a stage of knowledge. The first is official uncertainty. The second is public memory. The third is restored identity. As you read, you can feel the language becoming more human as the truth becomes clearer. Language is part of the work. Calling someone unidentified is accurate when identity is unknown, but it should never make them feel less like a person. Using a nickname can keep attention alive, but it should never replace the real name once known. Speaking gently can prevent the story from becoming spectacle. The Grateful Doe case teaches that words, like evidence, should be handled with care. The file does not contain tone, but we bring tone to it. Tonight, the tone is low, reflective, and patient. You are not being pulled through the case. You are sitting beside it. You are noticing how evidence moved, how people waited, and how a name returned. The pace is slow because the case itself was slow, and because sleep asks for steadiness. A steady pace also lets compassion remain present. When stories move too quickly, people become plot points. When the pace slows, Jason remains a person, his family remains a family, and the investigators remain people doing difficult work under imperfect conditions. The weird evidence remains interesting but not consuming. Everything has room. You can almost feel the chair beneath you now, the slight pressure of your arm on the desk, the quiet turning of another page. The next section might describe public response after the identification, and you read it with the same calm attention. People who had followed the case expressed relief. Some felt sadness that the answer had taken so long. Some reflected on the role of online communities. The emotions were varied, but the central fact was steady. Jason was identified. The young man once called Grateful Doe had his name restored. Those words may appear many times because they are the center of the case, and repetition can be gentle when it is used to honor what matters. You let the name remain clear in your mind, not as a sudden reveal, but as the stable point around which the older evidence now rests. The public response also shows how unresolved cases can create communities of care. People gather around a question and sometimes remain for years. They learn terminology, they learn caution, they learn the ache of uncertainty at a distance. When an answer comes, the community changes. It may feel quieter afterward, as if a long-held breath has been released. That release is part of the story too. In the Grateful Duo case, the release did not mean forgetting. It meant remembering correctly. It meant placing Jason's name into the public record and allowing the old nickname to become historical context. It meant letting the ticket stubs remain part of the path while no longer allowing them to define the person. You can feel the respectful rearrangement happening across pages and posts. There is a deep patience in rearranging memory. People do not always update their minds as quickly as a record can be changed. A nickname used for years may linger. A famous clue may remain the first thing mentioned. That is understandable, but the work continues. Each retelling can move the true name closer to the front. Each careful script can keep the balance right. So, as you continue through the file tonight, you keep saying Jason Callahan. You keep saying Grateful Duo only when you are referring to the case history, the public search, or the old nickname. This distinction is small but steady, like the ticking of a quiet clock. It keeps the person from being swallowed by the mystery that once surrounded him. The clock image fits the archive rule. Time is everywhere here, but not loudly. It is in the dates, the paper, the technology, and the years between report and resolution. It is in the family's waiting and in the public's delayed awareness. It is in the way a clue from one decade can become searchable in another. Time does not solve a case by itself, but time can change what is possible. Time also changes investigators. A detective who worked the early case may not be the same person who sees the final identification. Someone else may inherit the file. Institutional memory may thin. That is why documentation matters so much. The evidence must be able to speak, even when the original handlers are gone. In Jason's case, the preserved details remained legible enough for later work. Legibility is a quiet virtue. A clear note, a complete description, a properly labeled envelope, a database entry with enough specificity. These things do not feel dramatic, but they allow the future to understand the past. You can imagine a later investigator silently thanking an earlier one for writing something down carefully. The file becomes a conversation across years. The conversation in the Grateful Doe case included people outside official channels too. Public pages preserved and repeated details in accessible language. Forums allowed people to ask questions and compare possibilities. Social media helped information travel to those who might never search a government database. This public layer had to be handled carefully, but it became part of the identification path. You can think of it as a second archive, less formal and more fragile. Posts can be lost, links can break, images can be copied without context, comments can wander. Yet within that fragile archive, real leads can form. The challenge is to bring anything meaningful back into formal channels where it can be verified. Jason's case shows that movement happening in a productive way. The movement from informal attention to formal confirmation is one of the most important parts of the story. A possible match cannot remain only online. It must be reported, assessed, and tested. The family must be contacted appropriately. DNA must confirm. The official record must change. The public may notice the spark, but the investigation must tend the flame carefully. This is why patient detective work is collaborative but not careless. It welcomes information, yet filters it. It values public help, yet requires proof. It understands emotion, it depends on procedure. The Grateful Doe case sits in that balance, and the balance is what made the answer trustworthy. You can feel sleepiness gathering around the edges of the room, but the file remains clear. The sentences move slowly. The objects stay in place. The story keeps its low voice. There are no sharp turns here, only the gradual unfolding of how an unidentified young man with 2 concert tickets in his pocket was eventually named as Jason Callahan. The next thought is about the idea of home. Identification does not always bring someone physically home in the way people imagine, but it can bring them home in the record, home in family knowledge, home in language. Jason's name returned to his family's understanding and to the public record. The unknown file no longer held him apart in the same way. That return matters. Home can be a complicated word in a case involving travel. Jason had been moving, perhaps between places, perhaps with plans known fully only to him. The road was part of his final known story, but identity gives a person back to the places and people that knew them before the road. It reconnects the traveler to origin, memory, and family. The tickets showed where he had been. The name showed who he was. You can picture a map again with soft pencil lines. South Carolina, Washington, D.C. Virginia, the line is not exact in every detail, but it suggests movement. The case's work was to connect those places to a person rather than leave them as disconnected points. Evidence made the line. DNA named the traveler. The family gave the line meaning beyond geography. Maps in cold cases can be misleading if treated too rigidly. People do not always travel logically. They take rides, change plans, follow friends, wander, return, or disappear from expected routes. But maps still help you sit with distance. In the Grateful Doe case, distance is not only miles, it is the distance between an unidentified record and a missing loved one. The investigation slowly crossed both. You turn the page again, and perhaps there is an old printed image of the reconstruction. Its surface catches the lamplight differently than plain paper. You look at it with the knowledge that the face was an attempt, not the person himself. It helped, but it could never contain Jason fully. Reconstructions are tools of hope, and like all tools, they have limits. The artist's work deserves quiet respect. To create a face for public recognition is to work in uncertainty. Too much specificity may mislead, too little may fail to connect. The artist must find a middle ground, guided by available information and experience. You can imagine the careful adjustments, the erasing and redrawing, the attention to proportion. The final image enters the world carrying a question. For years, the question remained open. Do you know him? Have you seen him? Could he be someone missing from your family, your town, your memory? The image asked without speaking. People answered with possibilities. Most possibilities, perhaps, were not correct. That is normal. A public image invites many eyes, and many eyes will see different things. Then one possibility came closer. The image, the details, and the missing person's history began to align around Jason Callahan. You can feel the file's pace change slightly there, not into urgency, but into focused care. When a possible name appears after years, every step must become more careful, not less. The closer the answer, the more important the discipline. That is a useful thought for any investigation. Nearness can create haste. Haste can create mistakes. Patient work slows down at the threshold. It checks, confirms, documents, and waits. In Jason's case, that threshold led to DNA confirmation, and confirmation allowed the answer to settle without ambiguity. The file could breathe differently after that. You breathe differently too, as the listener detective at the desk. You know the name now, so you can return to the beginning with a changed understanding. The tickets no longer point into darkness. They point to Jason's last known movements. The nickname no longer holds identity. It marks the history of the search. The long wait no longer feels endless. It has a known resolution, though still a sorrowful one. This changed understanding is part of why solved cold cases are worth retelling gently. They show the path from uncertainty to truth. They let you honor the waiting without remaining trapped inside it. They also remind you that other cases may still be in the earlier part of the path, with evidence waiting for its future context. Jason's file becomes a quiet teacher for those cases. The teaching is subtle. Keep the small things. Share carefully. Update records. Listen to families. Use science. Avoid certainty too soon. Respect the person after identification. These lessons are not dramatic, but they are durable. You can carry them from one old file to another. Like a pencil tucked behind your ear, the desk lamp continues to glow, and the Grateful Doe file remains open. The night is still unfolding. There are more pages to consider, more textures in the evidence, more quiet implications in the way an ordinary concert ticket became part of a name's return. You do not rush towards closing it. You stay with the patient rhythm of the work, letting each fact settle before the next one comes into view. You might now imagine the ticket stubs not inside the envelope, but as they once were, carried casually in a pocket, maybe folded against fabric, maybe mixed with lint, a scrap of paper, a coin. or nothing else of consequence. They had no idea, if objects can be imagined this way, that they would one day anchor a public mystery. They were just remnants of entry, small proof of attendance. That casualness is what makes them so affecting. Important evidence is not always created with importance in mind. Sometimes it is carried unknowingly, sometimes it is saved by accident, sometimes it survives because no one throws it away. A cold case can turn on the afterlife of something almost discarded. You let that thought rest lightly without forcing it into wonder. It is enough to notice. The same may be true of photographs used in recognition. A family picture taken for ordinary reasons can later become part of an identification effort. No one posing for it imagines that future role. It is just a moment kept. Later, that kept moment may help a reconstruction make sense, or help a family member communicate resemblance to investigators. Ordinary preservation becomes extraordinary only later. Life leaves these small records constantly. Most are never needed for anything beyond memory. A ticket in a box, a photo in an album, a note in a drawer. But when a person becomes disconnected from their name in official records, these small records can become bridges back. The Grateful Duo case shows that transformation with unusual clarity. You can feel the case inviting you to value gentle record keeping, not in a fearful way, just as part of human care. Names on photographs, dates written softly on the back, stories told accurately, details preserved when they might matter. Families and investigators both depend on such traces when memory and records need help finding each other. In the case file, however, the traces were official and physical. The evidence had to be secured, not simply remembered. The difference matters. Family memory can begin a path, but official evidence confirms and documents it. The two forms of keeping meet again and again. One is warm, one is formal. Both are needed. You turn the page, and perhaps the file includes notes about unidentified person listings, or correspondence, or later updates. Each page is another sign that the case remained reachable. It did not vanish entirely into a closed drawer. Even if years passed quietly, the information could be brought forward when needed. That reachability is a quiet achievement. Many systems have to work for a cold case to remain reachable. Archives must be maintained. Evidence must not be lost. Digital records must be updated. Agencies must respond. Volunteers must share responsibly. Families must know where to turn. When all those things align, a case that seemed still can begin moving again. Jason's identification depended on such alignment. The alignment was not perfect or immediate, but it was sufficient. You can sit with that word again. Sufficient. The case did not require perfect knowledge of every moment. It required enough accurate evidence, enough public attention, enough family connection, and enough scientific confirmation. Enough became the doorway through which the name returned. There is comfort in that, because perfection is rarely available in old cases. Reports may be incomplete. Memories may fade. Photographs may be few. Evidence may be limited. Yet a case can still resolve if the remaining pieces are handled well. The Grateful Doe case shows that imperfect fragments can still become a truthful whole. The truthful whole is not complete in every personal detail, but it is complete where identification is concerned. Jason Callahan is no longer unknown. The file no longer asks the world to identify Grateful Doe. It tells the world who he was, while preserving the history of how the answer came. That history is what we continue to trace, slowly and without closing the folder. You can imagine the old nickname written in parentheses now, secondary to the real name. Jason Callahan, formerly known as Grateful Doe. The phrasing matters. It makes the nickname part of the search, not the center of the person. It lets the public find the case while guiding them toward the corrected truth. Language, again, becomes part of the care. As you keep reading, the idea of a case title comes forward. Weird evidence that solved the Grateful Doe case. The phrase points us toward the tickets, but the longer reading broadens it. The weird evidence did not solve the case alone. It helped make the case memorable, searchable, and humanly specific. It kept the door open until memory and DNA could walk through. This distinction is important. and you hold it softly. No single object should be made into a hero. Evidence works in relationship. The ticket stubs related to the shows related to a traveling community, the community related to public attention related to a possible match, the possible match related to family recognition related to DNA confirmation. The solution was relational. Relationship is perhaps the deepest quiet theme here. Jason was restored to relation, not just identification. Relation to his family, to his name, to the places he had moved through, to the public record. The evidence mattered because it reconnected what had been separated. The file's work was not merely to label, but to reconnect. You can let that word reconnect settle into the room. It has a gentle sound. It does not rush. It suggests two ends of a thread being brought back toward each other after years of slack. The Grateful Doe case is full of threads. Some were visible from the beginning, some appeared later. Patient work gathered them slowly. A thread can be fragile. Pull too hard and it breaks. Ignore it and it tangles. Follow it carefully and it may lead you somewhere. The ticket stubs were threads. The reconstruction was a thread. The online posts were threads. The family resemblance was a thread. DNA tied the final knot. This image is calm, and it suits the unhurried pace of the case. The archive room now feels almost timeless. You could be in 1995, with fax paper and phone lists. You could be in 2015, with online posts and DNA reports. You could be here now reading the solved file by lamplight. The case allows these times to overlap because the evidence traveled through all of them. You are sitting at the crossing point. At that crossing point, the old and new do not argue. They cooperate. The old physical clues provide substance. The new digital reach provides circulation. The lab provides identity in the deepest sense. The public provides memory. The file holds the record. Each part has its place. You might imagine a cold case unit reviewing older unidentified person cases after hearing about identifications like Jason's. The detectives might pull boxes from shelves, check what evidence remains, and ask whether newer testing is possible. The room might smell of cardboard and coffee. A copier might warm in the corner. Someone might write a list of cases to revisit. That is how one solved case can influence others without making noise. The influence may be practical. Check DNA availability. Update database entries. Improve photographs. Include personal effects clearly. Contact agencies across state lines. Each action is simple. Together they can change outcomes. The Grateful Doe case becomes one example among many, showing why the old boxes are worth opening again. You can feel the dignity of reopening an old box. It says the person inside the file still matters. It says time has not cancelled the duty to identify. It says new tools deserve a chance to meet old evidence. In Jason's case, the box had waited long enough, and when it was met by new attention, it answered. The answer did not arrive as a full biography. It arrived as a name and identity, which is both simple and immense. There is restraint in accepting that. We do not need to turn Jason's life into more than we know. We can honor the known facts and let the private life remain private. The evidence leads to identification, not possession. That may be one reason the tone must remain gentle. A louder tone would make the case feel like an object of consumption. A gentle tone keeps it as a record of care. You, as the listener, are not being asked to consume a mystery. You are being invited to sit with the work of naming someone after years of uncertainty. That is slower and truer. The file on the desk seems to settle again. The pages are aligned. The photographs are inside their sleeves. The notes are in order. You are still not closing it. You are simply allowing the next thought to rise, and the next thought is about how communities remember their own. The Grateful Dead community has long been associated with travel, shared experience, and strong collective memory. In Jason's case, that cultural memory became part of why the public cared about the unidentified young man with the ticket stubs. People could imagine the setting because many had known similar scenes. The parking lots, the music, the temporary friendships, the road after the show. That recognition gave the case emotional reach. Emotional reach can be helpful when it leads to respectful attention. It can make people share a case who might otherwise pass it by. It can bring specialized knowledge about events, routes, and community habits. It can create a network of people who understand why a young traveler might not be easily traced by formal means. In the Grateful Doe case, that reach helped keep the search alive. But emotional reach must remain tethered to facts. The ticket stubs proved attendance or possession of tickets, but not every detail of his movements. The van suggested a travel context, but not every choice before the crash. The public name suggested a music connection, but did not define his whole identity. You read the clues for what they can say, and you do not ask them to say more. This restraint protects the truth. It also protects sleep. The mind can rest when facts are allowed to be enough. You do not need to chase every imagined scene. You can sit with the ticket in the pocket, the highway in Virginia, the file in the archive, and the name restored years later. The path is quiet and sufficient. The case remains deeply atmospheric without becoming dramatic. Summer heat, stadium dust, highway light, old paper, computer glow, laboratory quiet, family stillness. These images carry the story gently. They help the listener remain inside the investigation without feeling pushed. Every setting belongs to the work of understanding. You turn another page, and perhaps it is only a blank separator, or a form with most of its fields completed. Even blank spaces can mean something in a file. They show what was not known at the time. Unknown name, unknown address, unknown next of kin. Later, some blanks can be filled. Others may remain. You notice the difference between the blanks that evidence closed and the blanks that respect leaves alone. The name blank was filled. That is the central restoration. Some smaller blanks about the final journey may remain softer, less certain, and perhaps not fully recoverable. It is all right to leave them. The purpose of this narration is not to pry, but to understand the patient path to identification. A solved identity can coexist with unanswered details. That coexistence is common in real life. We often know enough to honor someone without knowing everything. The file teaches that too. Jason's name is known. The evidence path is known in broad and meaningful ways. The years of unidentified status are known. The role of public attention and DNA is known. The remaining unknowns do not undo the answer. You can feel the calm acceptance in that. It is not resignation. It is respect for the limits of records and memory. After 20 years, some things may no longer be reachable. But the thing most needed for identification was reached. The file did what it could, with help from many directions, and the name returned. The next part of the story might drift toward how people talk about the case now. They speak of Grateful Doe as a solved Doe case. They speak of Jason Callahan as the young man who had been unidentified for 2 decades. They mention the tickets because they remain the memorable clue. They mention online sleuthing and DNA because both mattered. The retelling itself becomes part of the case's ongoing life. Every retelling has a responsibility. It can either flatten the story into a strange clue, or it can restore the full patience around that clue. Tonight we choose the second path. We keep the ticket stubs, but we also keep the evidence room, the family, the databases, the careful confirmation, and the restored name. The case breathes better when all those parts remain present. You can imagine someone listening in the dark, drifting in and out, hearing the name Jason Callahan repeated gently enough to remember it. That matters. A half-asleep listener may not hold every date or procedural detail, but they can hold the central respect. They can understand that a young man once called Grateful Doe was identified through patient attention to small evidence. They can rest with that knowledge. The script itself becomes another quiet room for the case, not an official record, not a source of proof, but a place of remembrance and reflection. Its job is to move slowly through the facts without sharpening them into suspense. Its job is to let the listener sit beside the investigation rather than be pulled through it. Its job is to keep Jason's name near the center. So we continue, with the file still open and the light still low. The next page returns us to the long years when the case was known but unsolved. You can imagine someone encountering the reconstruction for the first time during those years and feeling the familiar ache of an unidentified person's page. The details are specific enough to feel close but not enough to answer. That tension is quiet, but it can linger. People who follow Doe cases often carry many faces in memory. They may not know them personally, but they remember them as unfinished questions. Grateful Doe was one of those faces. The tickets made the question easier to describe, but the face made it harder to ignore. A young person, a recent concert, a highway, and no name. The mind returns. Returning is not the same as solving, but it prepares the ground. A case that stays in public memory is more likely to be seen by the right person eventually. That does not guarantee an answer, it only improves the chance. In Jason's case, the chance eventually met the right connection. The ground prepared by years of attention was ready. You might compare it to a seed waiting through winter, though gently and without making the image too large. The evidence was there, the public memory was there. The family connection was not yet joined to it. When the right season came, the case moved. Not suddenly exactly, but with the quiet inevitability of things finally touching. That touching happened through modern communication. Someone could see, share, compare, and reach out in ways that would have been harder decades earlier. A face could cross distance quickly, a possible name could be brought to attention, a family could be shown information. Then the official process could begin. The digital world, for all its noise, carried a useful signal. Signal and noise are another balance in online cold case work. Many comparisons may be wrong. Many comments may repeat known information. Many discussions may wander, but within the noise, a signal can appear if people are attentive. The challenge is to recognize the signal without being swept away by excitement. The Grateful Doe case reached that signal, and then let verification do what verification must. The verification restored Jason Callahan's name. You let that sentence remain unhurried. It is the line toward which all these pages move, and from which all later reflection returns. The evidence did not shout it at first. It whispered toward it across years. Patient people kept listening. Listening is another quiet form of detective work. Listening to what evidence can say. Listening to what families remember. Listening to what a community understands about its own patterns. Listening to what science confirms. Listening also means not filling silence too quickly. You can feel the file teaching that as your hand rests near the next page. The silence before identification was long. The silence after identification is different. Before, silence meant unanswered identity. After, silence can mean respectful reflection. Tonight we are in that second silence, looking back at the path without trying to disturb what has finally settled. The case is calm in the room because the central name is known. But known does not mean forgotten. If anything, the name allows better remembrance. Jason Callahan can be spoken of as Jason Callahan, not only as the young man with the tickets. The Grateful Doe case can be studied as a solved identification, not an open-ended mystery. That shift gives the story dignity. It lets the evidence take its proper place in service of the person. You continue to read, and the file's lessons keep unfolding in small, steady ways. A clue may be memorable because it is odd, but it becomes meaningful because it connects. A community may be informal, but it can assist when respectful. A database may be plain, but it can extend the reach of a file. A reconstruction may be imperfect, but it can open recognition. DNA may be technical, but it can answer a deeply human question. Each lesson has its own texture. The odd clue feels like paper. The community feels like voices. The database feels like light on a screen. The reconstruction feels like pencil and paper. The DNA feels like clean plastic labels and careful procedure. Together they create the sensory landscape of the case, and you move through it slowly. The landscape is not dark tonight. It is subdued, yes, and old, and touched by sadness. But it is also lit by care. Every preserved detail is a little light. Every respectful search is a little light. Every corrected record is a little light. The restored name is the clearest light of all, steady rather than bright. You can rest your attention there for a moment before turning onward. Jason Callahan. The name remains. The old ticket stubs remain. The highway remains in the record. The years remain part of the story. the patient work remains worth understanding. And the file, still open under the lamp, continues to offer its quiet pages, one after another, as the night moves slowly around you.